time to settle in, get coffee, get. Yeah, okay. So let's get rolling. Jose mentioned Ariana is not going to be here, so he's going to serve her purpose. Move to agenda item number 1, approval of the minutes from last time. Anybody move to approve? Okay. Anybody opposed or all those in favor? Do we have any public comment? Any updates, comments from committee members? You guys want to share? Item number 3 is our consent. It's the Environmental Mitigation Program update. I took a look at it. I didn't have any issues. It's just an update on the status of the existing. Anybody have any questions or concerns? Sarah's here and Tim's here as well. All right.
Is this part of added to that, or is this a different agenda?
I think that's a different agenda item.
Okay.
That's the forget what number that is.
Smart growth.
It says environmental mitigation program on the.
Yeah, that is the item number 8, I believe.
Okay.
That's for the next round of funding.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, good. All right.
Motion. Can I make the motion?
Information.
Just information? Okay. No. We're good. Okay. Number 4. Jose, updates.
All right, so let me try to do as good a job as Ariana does on the summary. So since your May meeting, the Transportation Committee recommended and the board approved the request by the City of San Diego to use their Sandec's transit debt financing and commercial paper program. This item came to you at your last meeting. The board also approved the Smart Growth Incentive Program funding recommendation for the Climate Action Plan for the City of El Cajon that the ITAC reviewed as well. The board also approved the final fiscal year 2019 program budget. This includes obviously all of the Transnet funds, and it includes the ITAC operating budget as well as the Transnet Early Action Program funds, and you've reviewed those as well. The board also reviewed the transportation cost estimating process. That was a presentation that came to the ITAC. The board's discussion focused mainly on how often estimates are updated, reasons for cost increases in costs, whether it's excessive regulation versus economic factors, as well as the frequency and format of communication to the board. Then, let's see, earlier this month, the Transportation Committee received the quarterly updates for both the EMP Land Management Program as well as Smart Growth Incentive Program and the Active Transportation Grant Program. In addition to the draft project rankings and funding recommendations, and you'll be hearing more about that today. There's 2 projects that we may have public comment on. The Transportation Committee also recommended that the board forward the AB 805 public transit report to the legislature. So AB 805 included a requirement that we needed to report on public transit, and also include some comments made by the Transportation Committee. And those comments include effectiveness measures such as % change in ridership, as well as a letter with clarification on what the cost to Sandec is to put this AB 805 report together, and also to identify which projects are currently in the RTIP to better demonstrate public transit needs in the region. And then finally, in terms of the recruitment of a new Sandec executive director, this process is still underway. In mid-May, after considering candidates who initially applied for the position, the Board of Directors approved continuing the recruitment. So this process is being continued. So the subcommittee reconvened in late May with Pam Derby, who's the executive recruiter with CPS HR, and they agreed on several strategies for seeking additional qualified candidates. During the past couple of weeks, Pam and the members of the subcommittee have been interacting with potential candidates and discussing opportunities. Several candidates have expressed interest in being considered for the position, and their applications are expected soon. So with a strong candidate pool forming and a desire to keep the recruitment moving forward, the subcommittee is planning to conduct shortlist interviews on Friday, June 22nd. And then following the board meeting that day. So the board is meeting on the 22nd, so after that we'll be having interviews. And then a date for finalist interviews with the full board has not yet been identified. So as soon as that is identified, we will be informing, obviously, the public and all others. That's it.
Last I thought it was negotiations with a identified sort of kind of some of the rose to the top. Did those fall apart?
Right. So there were two candidates that moved to final interviews with the full board. Those individuals were interviewed, and there was one candidate that was identified by the board. That candidate withdrew, and so the board decided to continue with the recruitment process.
So none of the initial candidates aren't part of the, it's a whole new list.
That's correct.
That's a shame.
So that whole thing about the political process intervening was an inaccurate characterization?
I don't know. I was actually out on vacation, so I came back and there was all these things that had happened.
Because there's a different explanation in the media, but I was just curious.
That was confirmed by the board on Friday that it happened. So,
The media account?
yes.
Oh, I see.
So Mayor Voss spoke about that. So there was a leak, and whatever they said was relatively accurate.
I was just personally curious, when you reference going back to the recruiter who's been involved since the beginning, was there any discussion of what the actual different strategies might have been? Because one would have thought, well, why wouldn't you have done those in the first place, kind of thing, But was there any discussion at the?
I don't know if there was any discussion. I mean, a lot of this was in
Closed
session.
Got it.
Yep. So that's my summary.
Okay,
Cool,
thank you. Item number 5, Lisa. And this is not Mark Davis.
Okay, so today we're hopefully closing out the fiscal year 17 Transnet fiscal and compliance audit process. As you may recall, last July, we began with the approval of the agreed upon procedures, and then the audit began at that point. And here we are with our final recommendation. Tricia Foster with Davis Farr LLP is here to present the final draft. And when she's done, then we'll come back to me and we'll go over the recommendation. Lisa?
So as Lisa said, I'm Tricia Foster. I'm just going to go over some of the actions that have been to date. So we presented the draft reports to you guys on March 14th, or Mark Davis did. We presented the draft reports to the Transportation Committee on March 16th, and the board approved the draft on March 23rd. There was only 2 significant changes between the draft and the finals. One was MTS, who was not in compliance with their rail operator eligibility, so they went and asked board approval to exclude certain one-time expenditures, which did occur. The board did approve that. So we went back and we looked through their exclusions, and we were okay with what they're excluding, and so that finding was dropped in the report. The other city that was significantly changed is the city of San Diego. So through this process, Sandec and the city of San Diego have been working on just kind of cleaning up their RTIP project. So there's been some adjustments. This city right now, they're actually planning on going for board approval on June 19th. So that's the only other city that's changed, and we haven't had any other significant changes. And that basically concludes my report, and I will turn it back over to Lisa for recommendation.
So because of the need for the RTIP approval, our recommendation is not the standard that we've had in all prior years. It is a little lengthier. So today, the ITAC is asked to, 1, accept the final fiscal year 2017 Transnet fiscal and compliance audit reports for the city of San Diego contingent upon approval of project adjustments at the June 19th City Council meeting. And 2, accept all other fiscal year 2017 Transnet fiscal and compliance audit reports as prepared by the independent certified public accounting firm of Davis Barr LLP in accordance with the agreed upon procedures, so the final audit reports may be issued. And now it's open for discussion and hopefully approval.
Well, I had one question. Morning, Tricia. Nice to see you. In your remarks, did I hear you use the word significant as a characterization with regard to the city of San Diego? Because our memo actually uses the word minor. And so I'm wondering if we're talking about the same things, or if maybe there's some elaboration to clarify would be helpful.
Oh, I misspoke. It was minor variances.
Yes.
I'm sorry about that.
And the city council meeting is on the 19th?
Yes, June 19th.
I'm assuming that's just their vote for it or against, don't change it, so you
Correct.
have to change your documents.
Right. Right now, the documents are put together as though the city council will approve.
Also, all of the city's changes are in the 16-14 RTIP amendment, which you'll see at your July meeting. So they've already been entered.
Brad or Guy, any other questions, comments, concerns?
Maybe I'm missing something here. Oh, okay. Are there different attachment A's? So there's, on page 7, I guess, of the packet, it talks about City Lemon Grove MOE requirement met or is corrected, and then it says see attachment A for summary of compliance. Now look at attachment A, it says glossary of terms.
It's, well, okay, so, yeah.
I'm looking at the wrong attachment A.
Look at page 11 of the report. That would be the attachment A. So this attachment 1 you've already seen. This was presented at, in March. So it's kind of a pages 3 through 15. That's kind of its own animal.
The A is under my staple. I didn't, sorry. So
got it.
That's
Okay.
where I didn't see the other A. Okay. Got it.
I'll move to accept.
A second.
Very good.
Second.
It was on that, were you on something? How'd it go overall? How was that?
Really first, you know, I don't even recall if there were any suggested change, process changes or anything this year. It was pretty-
For the fiscal year 17?
Yeah, for this year, yeah.
I think there were a couple minor, yeah, just minor.
But in general, yeah, it was pretty smooth.
Yeah.
And then you said this is an extended version from the past, a little bit different?
The recommendation?
Yeah.
Yes, the recommendation, we had to separate out the city of San Diego because according to board policy, right, any changes in Schedule A, anything in the transfer column has to be approved at least at the city council level. So we have to, it's contingent upon that.
So we have a motion and a second. All those in favor?
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. All right. Jose is going to lead us on this one as well. This is our annual report.
Okay, so at your meeting in March, ITAC members appointed a subcommittee to work on its annual report. ITAC members Arduino, Halpern, and Jennifer Fuller were appointed to serve. The annual report subcommittee has met 3 times to provide direction to staff as to what should be included in your annual report. Attachment 1 to your report includes a draft of this ITAC annual report. Significant changes since your last review of the report, which occurred in May, include just general formatting changes of the report, addition of an SP1 pie chart on page 11. This was requested by the subcommittee to illustrate the impact of the recent state grant funds. Addition of project pictures with captions, and text to the feature activities section starting at the bottom of page 14, going through the last page where we had shown placeholders previously. There's still a few areas that need to be updated, including areas that may need to be updated as the report goes through final production. And right now we are anticipating your final approval in July. So we're just asking for your feedback at this point.
Stuart and Caitlin should be commended. They did a lot of work on this.
And I believe the subcommittee is meeting again this afternoon after this meeting, correct?
We've got one scheduled. Yeah. Is Ariana available for that, or somebody else going to, from staff, come in?
If she doesn't come back, then I can be available.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. I know Dick had some concerns or questions on the pay-as-you-go, but I think those were addressed in our
Right, yeah, he had some questions regarding the amount of Transnet dollars that would be available after debt service, and just the whole notion of the pay-go for the Transnet Major Corridors program. But we addressed those during our chair briefing.
So, Brad, do you guys have any input or comments, suggestions? The more I look at it, the more I like it. I think staff's put a lot of work into it.
It seems like, is it a little longer?
It is a little longer.
I just noticed it looks good, lays out good again.
Mhm.
There must have been some additional.
Well, with the 10-year review,
Yeah.
SB1 stuff.
Yeah. And your letter on the 10-year, that's a 2-pager. That's the whole letter's in there, right?
Yep.
Yeah. That's good.
So this is just some information. I think if you guys, the best way, if you guys do have comments, just send them to Ariana.
But the sooner the better.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, so we're planning on bringing this back to the ITAC in July for your final approval. So I would say, before the end of this month, we'll have enough time to put it together and bring it back to you.
I think, on page 15, the paragraph on the transitioning to pay-as-you-go, personally, I think it's a good summary and expresses the intent that particularly Dick was interested in. I think hopefully before we go through final approval, we can get some feedback from him just to make sure he agrees with that. And I don't know whether whether he's likely to be at the next meeting or if we can between now and then.
Are you talking about the section page blue circle 15?
Yeah, blue circle 15.
Yeah, so there's that section that talks about transitioning from
Right.
accelerating projects to
Yeah.
So we talked about that a couple days ago, and he seemed to be
Oh, yes.
satisfied.
Yeah, he was on
The chair briefing call.
Got it. Oh, okay, cool. Well, if he's on board with that, good. Okay. The only other comment I had was just on blue circle 14, particularly with the continuing evolution of the executive director search, and given that that's not an ITOP direct responsibility. I wonder if we just take that paragraph out. But different people may have different.
Which one are you talking about on Mitigation?
The blue circle 14, yeah,
Yeah.
like 16, that new executive director.
It's probably old news, I mean, this
When
is
I
all
see it,
news.
So that, it's updated in the paragraph to be current. So are you, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's what you said.
But it could change by the time you're just saying it's.
Well, I'm just saying, it seems like it's kind of an evolving thing.
Right,
It's
right.
not a direct ITOC activity, and so I just wonder if, rather than put ourselves at risk of having something go out that ends up to,
That's a good point.
not exactly conform with what's happening at the time. What do we- But I don't have strong feelings about it. It just,
And it is a little, I mean, it's like we're reporting on something that's really not.
Yeah,
part of the
exactly.
role.
Great, yeah.
Like-
I would agree. I don't think it's, at this point, not necessarily. I think if had there been a new director, it would have been something good to add, but
Okay, so take out that paragraph.
if anybody feels strongly against it.
Okay.
Also related to this evolving is, I know there's, I think it's good that, you know, on the front, there's a deal about, you know, seats opening up and when somebody wants, has interest in, you know, on the list for ITOC seats, but we have a current open seat.
We do.
We do.
So,
I'll talk a little bit more about that.
okay.
Sure.
Well, I guess this is another one where it might be, you know, might be changing, you know, maybe this is appropriate just to say that periodically they open up and get on a list and not try to be snapped out with the exact process status of that day. As I'm talking myself out of any comment, any change. I think I'm good with it.
Okay, so keep that part as is then?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Well, we do have a subcommittee meeting scheduled. Like I said, any comments, just before the end of the month, sooner the better.
Well, I hope we'll do that, we'll approve final one next meeting, so we don't, all right, we're gonna send it back to the board. Yeah, okay.
Item number 7, the 2019 program budget amendments, state funding awards. Dawn, welcome.
Hi. So last fall, the Board of Directors approved the submission of several projects under the major SB1 funded programs. And we're really happy to be here to announce that the state has awarded more than $493 million to support these projects. Some of the major awards include about $345 million for our I-5 North Coast Corridor project, over $60 million for some border projects, $55 million for low sand corridor projects, and $2.4 million in planning grants. So today we're here to review the proposed budget amendments and an RTIP amendment that will incorporate these grant awards into the Sandec budget. So beginning with attachment 1 on page 2 of the report, on page 98 of your tablet, there's a list of the projects that have Transnet funds that are included in the budget and the RTIP amendments. This report is actually formatted as a single ITOC report with the full Transportation Committee report with it. So there are some projects in the Transportation Committee report that do not have Transnet funds. So that attachment is just to assist you as you review the item. And attachment 2, page 3 of the report.
I know it's 7, that's, my 7 says it's not available.
Oh, still, okay. We should probably get to one.
how could you grab one as well, Sam?
The one that mailed out to us, I think they weren't ready or something.
Yes.
Anybody else? I got 2.
Yeah, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. So that attachment 1 is the list of projects with Transnet funds, and attachment 2 is the RTIP amendment change report for the RTIP amendment. So Exhibit A of the Transportation Committee report is includes a list of all the state grant awards, and it summarizes the proposed changes to the capital and overall work program budgets. And the budget amendments propose SB1 and any required match funding to be added to the budgets. For capital, this is an increase of just over $552 million for the total capital program budget. There is one exception, and that is a Bataquito Sagoon double track project because it was included in the approved fiscal year 2019 program budget with some state formula funds that were scheduled for construction to be used as a leverage to another grant that was applied for. But unfortunately, the other grant wasn't received and it left the construction phase not fully funded. So we are actually proposing to reduce the Bataquitos double track project to pull back those formula funds until we can find full funding for the project. Part of that is the fund source has some fund use rules, and if we leave them there, they're at risk of being lost to the project and to the region. So that's the one exception, it's a reduction in the budget. So for the overall work program, Sandec was awarded $2.4 million for 6 OWP projects, 2 of which have Transnet funds as a match source. The total increase to the OWP budget is $2.6 million, and that can be found in attachment 4, Exhibit C, beginning on page 19 of that attachment or page 119 if you are looking at it electronically. So we'll move on to Amendment 13 to the 2016 RTIP. That begins on page 39 of attachment 4 and page 139 if you're following electronically. This covers, again, fiscal years 2017 through 2021, implementing projects in the long-range regional plan, and it incorporates changes related to these state grant awards. It also reflects proposed budget amendments presented today, as well as some of the budgets that were approved on May 25th by the board that were not yet incorporated into the RTIP. And those include the Inland Rail Trail Vista segment and some local partnership program funds for the Coastal Rail Corridor that were already approved at the May 25th board meeting. So a total of 15 projects are in the proposed amendment. 3 of them are new projects, the I-805 North Ox Lanes, signal respacing and optimization both have Transnet funds, and a third, the Advanced Technology Corridors at Border Ports of Entry, is not Transnet funded, but is a new project in the RTIP. So details of the proposed changes are found on pages 45 through 55. And the proposed amendment underwent the public comment period that closed on Monday. During that public comment period, there's a line in each RTIP sheet that indicates the change reason. 6 of the projects were updated during the public comment period to really call out the fact that these were adding new fund sources. And those were the only changes made during public comment.
Did you receive any comments?
No other public comments. We just made those changes to a little more accurately reflect the new fund source. And so that concludes the report. We're available to answer any questions. Sandy's here too if there are any questions about the match on the planning.
You confused me on the Bataquitos. So it looks like SB1 funds were awarded for that. But
Yes, we had local partnership program formula funds that were approved by the commission for the project. And that was about $9.4 million. But that $9.4 million was programmed to that project as leverage for a transit and intercity rail capital program grant that we applied for. So it didn't fully fund construction of the project, it was a piece of the construction funding for the project. And then the transit and intercity rail capital program grant did not materialize.
Does that affect the construction program, project itself? The funding?
It would, yeah.
Yes, construction will be
Yeah, because the
delayed.
project
Delayed.
remains not fully funded for construction.
so
Yes.
Because it's underway now, right?
So formula funds,
It's underway.
Well, the design is.
Design.
so formula funds are basically a regional selection. So we select projects and propose those formula funds be programmed to the project. And there's a regular amendment process with the California Transportation Commission, should you want to amend projects or move those funds. It's not the same kind of competitive grant that some of these other funds are.
Guy, you had
I think I'm figuring this out, but so last month we had a item for the 2018 RTIP to provide feedback on the listing of transit projects in the new RTIP, and then here we're amending the old one, and I was just trying to reconcile how do you guys, how does
Well,
that work?
Sandy or I can help, but the 2018 RTIP, there's quite a long lead time to develop that. That RTIP actually would be approved in the fall by the board and would receive state and federal approval by December. So
Okay.
during that time period, up until full approval of that, the 2016 RTIP is still in effect. So making these last few amendments to the 2016 RTIP allow these grants to be incorporated into the RTIP and the projects to move forward for allocation and use of the funds.
Okay, so you could even see.
Well, when I bring the draft RTIP back to you next month, these updates will be included. We'll go ahead and update the projects, so the list that you'll see next month, you'll see these SB1 funds, assuming the board approves.
Yeah, so conceivably, if you had a need, you could even have another amendment to the 2016 RTIP.
We can.
You'll be seeing one in July.
Okay.
Yeah. Amendment 14 will be coming back.
And then
to
you
in
just
July.
roll those changes forward and update the draft.
Yes.
until it gets approved.
Correct.
Okay.
I have another question. So with the voter initiative or whatever, the ballot measure, they could repeal SB1? And my assumption is we don't spend these monies immediately. We just budget for them. But what happens, would you go back through and repeal all of this if that SB1 gets repealed?
We would need to amend the program budgets and the RTIP budgets pending actions by the state and direction by the state on what the result of that would be. So there are a couple of things. The only project in this group of projects that would be moving to construction prior to November would be the I-5 North Coast Corridor project. All of the fund sources for that segment are state fund sources, this SB1 funding and STIP funding. So the state would need to determine what next steps would be for that particular project. We are assuming that as in past state fund sources, when they've had fiscal constraint issues, that projects that were already awarded and under contract would face less risk and less uncertainty with the future. A lot of the funds that are being programmed are programmed in future years, so have not yet started. Again, we would be waiting for some direction from the California Transportation Commission and the state on what the future plans are for those.
Yeah, essentially, I mean, you've got, the gas tax dollars began to be collected November of last year. So there's already been some dollars that have been collected. The California Transportation Commission has identified a number of projects through a number of programs to receive additional gas tax dollars. The sort of the uncertainty is if the repeal effort is successful, then what would the state do with those dollars that have already been collected? And so the thinking is that they would likely focus those dollars on those contracts that have been awarded. So if you have a construction contract that's already been executed, that would have sort of a higher level of priority over a project that has not yet been awarded for construction. But it's something, if let's say that there's a lot of construction contracts that are awarded between now and November, and those exceed, the amount that has been collected, then the CTC would need to figure out, okay, how are we going to deal with this? So
Who represents Sandec?
well, it's a statewide body, so Sandec is not necessarily represented on the CTC, but there are two CTC commissioners from the San Diego region, Tim Adaffer and Christine Kehoe. Yep.
So I have a different kind of a question. On the first page of the presentation, it talks about the role of ITOC. The italicized language calls out that part of the reason why we're even having the discussion, or this is put in front of us in the first place, is the opportunity for ITOC to raise concerns regarding the eligibility of projects proposed for funding before any expenditures are made. Is there actually some place in the, recognizing that pretty much all of these, as I can see, are adding funds to existing projects, so the eligibility shouldn't be a question. But in the backup materials, is there any place that actually speaks to the staff's view about eligibility, just sort of a, speaking to this italicized language? Do you understand what I'm asking?
You mean something that's where staff says, we've reviewed this for eligibility and we
Right.
believe it's X, Y, and Z, and therefore recommend.
Yeah.
I don't think we've ever included that in.
Yeah, so essentially,
the report.
if staff brings forward, let's say an article amendment or a budget amendment for a project that has transnet dollars, there's sort of an implicit understanding that we've gone for a review like this, and
no, I
we
understand
wouldn't bring
that.
you something that we don't think is, appropriate.
We do challenge agencies as they propose projects, new projects in the RTIP to, on occasion, we'll see somebody, programming transnet dollars on something that, we have some question with, and so we will meet and confer and discuss the project and merits, and sometimes you never see those because we determine transnet is not an eligible fund source for it. So that does happen. We don't incorporate that type of language in this report. Is that something?
Well, I guess, in the triennial performance report, one of the recommendations that the consultants made was to, for collectively everybody to strive to make presentations a little bit more focused with regard to decision-making ultimately. And as I read this, and I recognize other members of this committee are far more expert in relating to these matters than I, but the call out seems to suggest that, as I started, one of the principal reasons that this is brought to the ITOC is for review of the question of eligibility, and it would seem then that, just to Dustin's point, for if there's some, just as part of the presentation, just some explicit clarity that staff has reviewed this for eligibility, which we probably could assume without even asking, or if there's citation as to where in the ordinance it specifies that these projects, particularly if we were talking about new projects where eligibility might be some discussion, because I believe don't we have later in the on our agenda a question that actually speaks to eligibility of a project. So my point being, just to sort of help us fulfill what allegedly seems to be a responsibility here.
So we can be more explicit, I think.
Being a little bit more explicit to this point
Yeah,
would
we can believe it.
at least help me. Thanks.
Are there any other outstanding potential awards of money coming? that
Not
we
for the
haven't heard?
first cycle of SB1. They have actually issued the first call for projects for the next cycle. Actually, they've issued two calls, one for the ATP program, Cycle 4, and then they've just announced that the local partnership program formula grants for the next cycle applications are due at the end of August. So there are currently two calls for the next cycle.
I was personally disappointed that the San Diego double track bridge replacement rail platform project didn't make the cut. cool project to see come to fruition.
Yeah, so we are moving forward for final design on several of the Lausanne corridor projects, and the latest we've seen of the next federal bill does include some additional FRA and other grants, so we will continue to work on final design and search for additional funding for those projects.
This is just a discussion item. Any other questions, concerns? Thank you, Don. Item 8, Sarah, in our environmental mitigation program.
Michael, do you have that clicker?
I think there's
I believe I'm the first PowerPoint of the day. Good to see some good pictures. Okay, so good morning. Item 8 on the ITALK agenda contains what we're calling the draft project rankings and funding recommendations for our 9th cycle of the Environmental Mitigation Program Land Management Grant Program. You've heard a lot about these grants through quarterly reports. They're very important to help maintain the integrity of our regional preserve system through enhanced land management actions, and they're a key component of our environmental mitigation program. I was here last fall to present to you this call for projects, and that call was later approved by our board of directors. So today's presentation is just intended to provide you with some information and to allow for any discussion on these draft project rankings, and then that discussion, if there is anything substantial, will be forwarded on to the board of directors next month when they hear this item. So we've had 8 previous grant cycles. We've awarded 98 grants in our past 10-12 years of this program. About $14.5 million in Transnet funding has been awarded, and that's been matched by about $9.5 million in funding that grantees have brought in as well. So the picture that I threw up on the PowerPoint here is just to show you one of our past grants. This is a picture of the Salt Creek area out near the Olympic Training Center. The County of San Diego was awarded some funding back in 2008 to do a large-scale kind of cactus run habitat restoration project. And we went out and checked out the site last spring, so you can see it still looks really nice. And we do go back and double check on these grants to see how they're faring after they've closed out. So for this 9th cycle of the grant program, our applications were due in January. We received 39 applications, which is the most we've ever received. I think last cycle we were around 32 or 33. And today we're recommending funding for 19 of those projects that total $2 million altogether. So the funding for this 9th cycle of land management grants was split between 2 categories. So we have the threat reduction stewardship category, and that's really intended to fund kind of gap funding for project managers who need just small amounts of funding for real kind of short-term activities on their lands. The maximum that you can apply for in that category is $80,000, and those projects have to be completed within about 18 months. So those would be projects like kind of some signage and fencing that you might need to take care of, maybe a little bit of erosion control, real discrete actions. And then we have the species and habitat recovery category, and that's intended to fund longer-term, larger-scale habitat restoration and enhancement projects that take about 3 to 5 years to complete. So our Environmental Mitigation Program Working Group selected an evaluation committee at their January meeting, and that committee met in March to review the applications for this cycle of grant funding. And similar to the Smart Growth and Active Transportation Program that you'll hear about in the next item, a sum of ranks approach was used to pull all those scores together and to get the final rankings that you can see in your attachments today. So based on the evaluation committee's rankings, the EMP working group is recommending funding 13 projects in that threat reduction stewardship category. And if you look through your attachments, I know you have the transportation committee report attached to your ITAC report. It's attachment 1 in there, pages 5 to 7. Highlighted in yellow, you can see those short-term projects that are recommended for funding today. And then if you look at attachment 2, you'll be able to see highlighted in green on pages 8 and 9 those longer term, larger scale species and habitat recovery projects that are recommended for funding today. So totaling $2 million, that's what our award amount is. And then our grantees will be bringing in an additional about $750,000 in matching funds to support these projects going forward. And just important to note here that the spreadsheets that you have in front of you, they've all been double checked for accuracy. And all of the projects that applied for funding, all those 39 applications were deemed eligible per our eligibility criteria in our call for projects. So in terms of timeline, we're working our way down what you see on the screen here. The EMP working group heard this item at their May meeting, and then in June, a couple weeks ago, I presented this information to the Regional Planning Committee and the Transportation Committee just for information and discussion as I'm doing here today. Next month, it'll be brought back to the Regional Planning and Transportation Committees for a recommendation, and then pending board approval later in the summer, hopefully the end of July, we'll be able to execute these grant agreements in the fall of this year and get these projects started. So today, the ITAC is just asked to review the information that's in the report in front of you to ensure that the projects that are recommended for funding are consistent with the Transnet Extension Ordinance provisions. And that's all I have. So just a short overview of these projects, and happy to answer any questions that you might have about the projects themselves or about our process that we're going through.
Questions? Can you explain the sum of ranks?
Yeah.
I don't quite follow what.
So I think we had about seven reviewers, Kim, who looked at the projects, and every single one of them goes off independently, reviews all of the applications, puts together their scores, so they end up with a point total out of 100. And then at the end of that, they're ranked. So if you got 100 points, you'd be ranked number 1, so to speak, and if you were maybe 20 points, maybe you'd be ranked number whatever, you'd be the last ranked. And then since we have each of those spreadsheets from each reviewer, we pull all of the ranks together from those. So if every single reviewer ranked one project number 1, the sum of ranks, that's going to rank as number 1. It'll be the highest ranked project. So it's just a way to kind of get around people who might score easy or people who might score hard. So instead of looking at a point total, we're looking at the ranks overall to kind of adjust for that point variability in the scoring, if that makes sense. Okay.
For the habitat and species recovery, the required match amount, how is that determined? I see some is looks like you match the grant amount requested.
Yeah.
Others, there looks to be some percentage of the total amount requested. Is there a formula that's used, or why is it not a straight dollar for dollar match?
So there's no requirement for how much that you have to match for that category. However, the more that you match, the more points that you get. So it does influence the overall score. So you could potentially apply in that category with no matching funds, but it would impact your score going forward. So that's why you see the variation in the percentages that they might be matching.
Last question that I have, for the short-term threat reduction, no requirement for any match on that?
No requirement for any match on that. That was a change that we made about 2 cycles ago, was to, have some money set aside for these short-term projects that really didn't require a lot of funding and that folks may not have match for, to make it easier for them to access those funds and to really make the match not a requirement, but it helps you along in the process if you're applying for one of these bigger grants. So that was one of the changes that we made last cycle, and it seems to have been fairly successful with the grantees going forward.
You have any questions?
Yeah, no, I guess the thing I'm just thinking about, I'm curious, and it relates perhaps to Ray's presentation later, is the concept of using ranking as opposed to raw score, if you will, sort of the generally accepted best practice universally for doing these kinds of rankings? Is that the statistical gold standard, if you will, or is that something that just happens to be a sort of something that Sandec seems to prefer? It seems like this is the type of thing that, academicians, whomever out in the world, there should be a consensus as to the preferred approach. And I see the logic as to why this might be it. I'm just curious if you've thought of that in the context of the other kind of data quality control kinds of things that Ray has been overseeing.
Yeah, I guess I can't speak for many of the other programs at Sandec other than to say that within the kind of the grant managers here, and Audrey will talk about this in a second, that's kind of a consensus that we've gotten to over the years, doing numbers and numbers of cycles of these, that if we do a sum of ranks approach, it really allows us to really hone in on who scored, you know, what projects rose to the top, so to speak, without getting into the nitty-gritty of the point values. And so that's something, I don't know, Colleen, if you have anything else to add there, but that just seems to have worked well for the grant programs.
One of the things from my experience is if an agency, whatever kind of proposals they are, if you're ranking something and you have one reviewer that has a favorite and they give you like 100 and they give all the others 10, they could skew the whole panel by, but if they go to the ranking, it avoids somebody being able to skew the whole process, if that makes sense.
You know, like I said, I understand the logic. It just strikes me that we're not the only institution that does rankings, and this is the type of thing, it seems to me, that there would be like a global consensus that from a statistical standpoint, this is the way you do it, or you do it a different way. And I was just curious, like I said, if, you know, as all the things that Ray's looking into or overseeing in terms of data management processes, whatnot, if this would be the one that outside experts would say, yes, do it that way.
Yeah, we haven't looked into this specifically, but it does bring up an interesting question, and we certainly could do some research to see what other people are using. I think that's a great suggestion.
Yeah, and by the way, I don't question it at all. It just, like I said, it strikes me that it's the type of thing that the outside world should be able to externally validate the approach.
We'll look into that.
Thanks.
Any other questions for Sarah? Thank you, Sarah.
Good morning. All right, so like Sarah, I'm going to be presenting the draft project rankings for the active transportation grant program and the Smart Growth Incentive Program. So we also came to you in the fall and reviewed the evaluation criteria with you guys and let you know that $30 million was available through this funding cycle. The call for projects was released by the board and was closed in mid-March. We received 55 applications requesting over $55 million. So as you can tell with those numbers, it was a highly competitive process, and we got a lot of great applications throughout the region. As with all calls, staff performed a preliminary eligibility check. There were a few projects whose eligibility came into question, but ultimately staff decided to conduct the quantitative scoring and then pass on the applications to the evaluation panel to be scored and ranked. The projects recommended for funding are highlighted in green in each of the tables in the staff report. In addition, I want to draw your attention to page 24. The Transportation Committee recommended an adjustment to how the evaluation panel had proposed to allocate the active transportation capital funds, which would add the Massachusetts Avenue Bike and Ped Improvements Project and the Prospect Avenue and Mesa Road Improvement Project to the list of those recommended for funding. Staff has identified 2 Smart Growth Incentive Program projects, one planning, one capital, that could benefit from additional review by the ITAC. These are listed in the staff report. The first is the St. Joseph's Park Master Plan proposed by Civic San Diego, which would fund the development of a park master plan for a 1.4-acre park in downtown adjacent to the St. Joseph's Cathedral, which is bounded by 3rd and 4th Avenue and Ashen Beach Street. The project proposal indicates the plan will include underground parking with bike parking and EV electric vehicle charging stations. It is a gray area whether the park master plan is sufficiently related to transportation in accordance with the Transnet extension ordinance. The second project is the Fred Fleet Extension, also proposed by Civic San Diego, which would fund the purchase of 10 electric vehicles for the on-demand downtown San Diego electric shuttle, as well as electric vehicle charging stations. Staff recommends that this project be deemed ineligible because the intent of this Smart Growth Incentive Program is to fund planning and capital infrastructure as opposed to rolling stock that improve the public realm and support smart growth. Civic San Diego is here to provide additional information on the projects and how they believe the eligibility criteria is being met. In conclusion, the ITALC is asked to review and provide input on the eligibility of all the projects recommended for funding, including the two projects that I mentioned on page 24. So I'm here to answer any questions about the process, about the projects, and then Civic has planned a presentation for you guys.
So Audrey, it sounds like you clearly identified what the problem was for the FRAD fleet expansion. What is the concern with the first item, the
Right,
St.
so
Joseph's Park?
staff doesn't have a recommendation on that one in particular because we do recognize it as kind of questionable, and that's why we've kind of been using the term gray area. Again, these are intended to be related to transportation and incentivize smart growth. So a park master plan it's questionable whether or not that is related enough to transportation. That answers your question?
Yeah, I wanted to get where
Yeah.
staff's concerns were.
Yeah.
Maybe there are questions for Audrey before we have the presentation? Should we move forward with the presentation then?
Sure.
Okay. Recognize
Good morning, I'm Kathleen Brandon, Senior Planner and Landscape Architect with Civic San Diego. I'm here to present St. Joseph's Park. It's a master plan for a park and an underground parking garage. It's located in downtown, one of the highest residential and commercial development areas of all of San Diego, with a growing population of 37 to 90,000 residents planned. Currently, we are producing 25 to 30% of all new housing in San Diego, and we have the highest number of transit facilities. So parks and open space is a high priority for the downtown residents. Per the Designing for Smart Growth, Creating Great Places in the San Diego Region Guidebook, they do recommend that neighborhood parks are part of the smart growth development. And this would be a neighborhood park for Cortez neighborhood. It contains currently 10,000 residents with 7,000 workers. Also, this park is located adjacent to the proposed cycle tracks. The first phase cycle track is on Beach Street. That's one of the streets, which is on the north side of the park. That's the street that's running horizontally. And then it'll be adjacent also to a second cycle track on 4th Avenue, as well as another block away, the cycle track on 5th Avenue. It is also located 1 block south of the proposed greenway on Cedar Street. So it is adjacent to a lot of different transportation options. And it also is adjacent or in the vicinity of 2 major couplets to the I-5 freeway. One on 4th Avenue exit and one is the Ash Street exit. So what we see this as is not just a park design, we see this as a transit option of people coming into the city as a place to park, and from there you use your 1 mile option of multiple transportation options throughout the downtown to actually get to your location. It is also located adjacent to 2 major bus routes that are going north-south in the downtown to Hillcrest. So Cortez Hill neighborhood is near also some affordable housing, which are items also put into the design guidelines, as well as to a very active senior center. So this are 2 images of our proposed underground parking garage under our East Village Green Park. That's coming in East Village. It's in plan design right now, or we're about to submit drawings for permitting. But in the top image, you can actually see that is a community center, but underneath is 2 levels of underground parking. So the same concept is going to be used at St. Joseph's Park. So again, this park is really a giant green roof on top of a transit facility. It'll have bike storage, electric charging vehicles, van pool parking, and it's also a public parking garage, so we'll have the on-demand parking, be able to see if there's spaces available for the community. So in the downtown community plan, St. Joseph's Park is listed as a 1.4 acre park with flexible space for recreation, children's playground, off-leash dog park, and then the underground parking garage. It is actually specifically listed in the downtown community plan. It serves residents, the senior center, commercial, employees, and adjoins the church patrons. So we requested a $165,000 grant. We have matching funds of $135,000, and we plan to have the general development plan completed in 24 months. And I'm here to answer any questions.
What's the cycle, class 4 cycle? Is that a
cycle
What is
track?
that exactly?
That is the segregated bike paths. So it's where you have a bike path, and then you have approximately a 3 to 4 foot safety area.
Yeah,
You want
it's basically moving the parking lane away from the sidewalk, so you provide a protected bike lane that's not adjacent to any traveling vehicles. Sandec is constructing the 4th and 5th Avenue cycle tracks from Hillcrest down to C Street, and then the city will be constructing the Beach Street also within the next year.
So they're different type of bike paths that are basically, when you say level 4, whatever it was called, is that a different type of bike path that's there versus the ones that go through Hillcrest or things like that?
Right, it's not, the ones up in Hillcrest currently, to get to the parking spaces, you have to drive through the bike path. These are flipped so that you don't have any interaction with cars at the bike paths, except at intersections and driveways.
So I read that it's a neighborhood park, but with the parking underground, you're attracting out of city, or excuse me, out of downtown area to come. Is that the goal?
No, the goal is to provide public parking for whoever needs public parking. So the goal is really, and the goal is also to get people out of their cars in the downtown. So whether it's trying to get people that are coming in from other areas of the county and saying, park here, get out of your car, and then get on your bike and ride to work, or it's also for the neighborhood to basically say, this is where we can park if we have a friend coming to visit, or it's basically on demand. So it's going to be available to anybody who could possibly use it or need to use it. But really it's about creating a transit option so that we have less cars driving around downtown.
Is there a certain number that must be reserved for park users? So if I came and I wanted to go to the park specifically, is there a number of spaces that are guaranteed?
We are not doing that at East Village Green, and we don't anticipate doing that for this park as well. So it really is a public, first come, first serve.
Yeah.
But it'll be part of the system. Ben Verdugo here is part of manages the parking garages in downtown. And there's going to be an on-demand system, so you can actually check on an app. Right? On the app, is there spaces available, how many, and actually reserve a space? Is that how it works?
You can. So we're getting to the point where all of the garages we manage are getting to the smart system. So you really, once you're going into downtown, you have the capability to find out if there's parking at that garage. And there's also ways to prepay for parking as well. We're starting to do that with our Park and Market and 60K parking garage. There's no reason why that wouldn't be done at any future development garages as well.
Who do you work for?
Civic San Diego as well. So I manage all parking mobility projects in the footprint of downtown San Diego.
I'd like to get your card. I want to talk to you about
Is there data downtown or in other urban settings to support the idea that by adding parking, you encourage transit and pedestrians? I guess, I think you're saying you add parking and then it gives people option to get there and then go use transit and pedestrian and bikes. I guess it seems a little counterintuitive.
Yeah, I think what we recognize is that even though downtown is very transit rich, not everyone is going to come in on a bus or a trolley, and therefore the other mobility choices, Fred, bicycle infrastructure, pedestrian infrastructure, are all key. But for those people who do insist on driving downtown, we want to get them get their car parked and get them out of it as quickly as possible, and then have them take the other choices. So it's just a recognition that there will still be people who insist on driving in it downtown. We just want to get them out so they're not driving around causing congestion, looking for parking.
Is there a acre requirement for parkland within the downtown area. I can't remember if the downtown, is the downtown community plan now? Do they have a recommended acreage for the number of residents?
It follows the citywide one for neighborhood parks. It's 2.8 acres per 1,000 residents. Our community plan does not meet that goal. However, the city is updating they just started their park master plan process because they recognize in older urban neighborhoods to meet that 2.8 ratio is almost impossible everywhere. So we have park sites identified. We've acquired a number of them. As Kathleen said, we're going in a plan check for phase 1 of East Village Green Park, and this will likely be the next park downtown.
You know, just from my personal opinion, it meets what smart growth should be. Provide parking, you get people out. I understand it may be borderline, but I wouldn't see it personally as borderline. So I would feel comfortable saying this meets the intent, but that's just my personal opinion.
Are there buildings? Are there buildings there now? I mean, what is there now?
It's mostly a parking lot. Right now, there are 2 buildings that are owned by the city. They're, I think, the residential above and commercial space below, like old storefronts. But those would be torn down. So part of the general development plan process is to follow the city process for park design, which would include the public workshops. So we would be going out to the community and asking them for input on how to develop this park specifically. And so that would develop what kind of buildings we would build, if any, and what kind of activities would actually be on the park.
So you display, are people living there now and storefronts there now that would be displaced if you did this?
It was always intended to be a park, and when it was purchased, it was always intended to have those buildings removed.
Sorry, kind of falling back up on my earlier thing, because I see, I mean, in terms of eligibility, you talk, supporting the community's overall development plan and infill build, I see that, so that I guess I'm kind of stuck on, I'm encouraged to get on the trolley if I can't find parking downtown, or if parking's so expensive that I don't want to, that the trolley's a better option. But if by providing more parking, saying it's increasing transit, it just doesn't sit with me. So I'm struggling with that a little bit, but
One of the keys to addressing over parking projects, especially project by project, because it adds a lot of cost to all development, especially residential development, is the concept of unbundled parking and shared parking. This public parking garage can serve residential, commercial, everything else. So the spaces, rather than be occupied a portion of the day, they cannot be occupied 24 hours by all these different type of users, and that way it decreases the parking demand on adjacent projects and helps incentivize them.
That part I totally get. I mean, yeah, it's just the idea that it encourages transit is the part I'm stuck. But that's,
it's definitely right on the border. Downtown is a unique entity, to say the least.
I'm not opposed to the project. There's eligibility according to the. I mean, these criteria here are in the ordinance.
Yeah, so I actually pulled up the ordinance language. So if you scroll to page number 45 in terms of eligibility, consistency with the Transnet Extension Ordinance, proposed projects can include, and this is a quote, broad array of transportation-related infrastructure improvements that will assist local agencies in better integrating transportation and land use, such as enhancements to streets and public places, funding of infrastructure needed to support development in smart growth opportunity areas, consistent with the Regional Comprehensive Plan, and community planning efforts related to smart growth and improved land use transportation coordination.
The way that reads, I feel like I'm more comfortable with it.
Yeah.
It seems like, I think what we've done we collectively, the process over the years, these are criteria that we've been evaluating the grant application based on, but trying to overreaching goals, meeting the ordinance.
Right, so every cycle we go over the criteria, we refine it, we add some definitions and the like, but ultimately, we're asking you today, is it consistent with the Transnet Extension Ordinance to be considered eligible to receive funding?
Like, I have a few reactions. One is, I'm curious, did you explicitly score this project relative to the criteria on pages 39 and 40?
Page 39 of the report.
Yeah, and attachment 2, sorry. What I'm looking at is page.
Right, so these are just, this list in front of you is eligible projects. There is a set of criteria that has points associated. There's a quantitative section that Sandec staff scores. There's a qualitative that all of the evaluators score. So this is not.
Okay, but you did score the particular project, these two particular projects.
Right.
As part of the process, and maybe it's in here, but I'm not sure. Did you include the scoring results?
Yes. So
Where's
that is on page, I believe, not 24, because that's the active transportation.
Or is it within? No.
Yeah, it's. It is on page 21. So as I mentioned in my report, Sandec staff did a preliminary eligibility check. We did identify these as questionable, but decided to pass it on to the evaluators. So the evaluators were just given a set of projects, and they scored that independent of Sandec and ranked them. So you'll see that in the Smart Growth Incentive Program planning project, there's all of the projects are recommended for funding given the amount of projects that were submitted and the amount of dollars requested and the amount available. So we're just highlighting that, you know, we're doing our due diligence and checking to make sure that every project that was submitted is eligible before the board takes action to, you know, approve or not approve the funding recommendation. Does that answer your question?
Yep, thank you. No, I was just looking for where it showed up in the scoring things.
Yeah, so it looks like they ranked 8th out of 13 projects.
So I guess one personal impression, and then I just have a couple of questions. So I guess my personal impression is, I understand why the Fred acquisition does not fit with the program. It's sort of an unfortunate thing that, at least from my perspective, the Fred program clearly supports the notion of getting people out of their cars and alternative modes of transportation, and so it would be an unfortunate thing to be sort of denying that one. But to Kai's point, this one, you know, it's basically saying we're providing more parking for people to bring their cars downtown to some extent. So it seems a little weird to me. But having said that, I'm curious, what would happen to this project if you did not get this money from Sandec?
We would probably have to wait a little bit and move forward anyway. Eventually, we would move forward with developing the park site and a general development plan.
Not to stall discussion, but they do have one more presentation on the Fred. So if we wanted to hear that one as well.
Quick question. Brad, working off your comment of shared parking, is there a way to enter into negotiations or contracts with specific residential so that you have a guaranteed number of spaces available to them, so that it would promote them to park in those locations and use alternative forms of transportation from there, as opposed to making it all public such that Joe Schmo can drive downtown and go from there, which would, I think, would not increase use of alternative transportation.
We're in the process of updating our parking plan for downtown. We're supposed to do that every 5 years. And so one of the preliminary suggestions from our consultant is to develop this shared parking model where we can sort of be a database using private parking lots and also underutilized public parking lots where we connect parkers that are coming into downtown. And so you'll find out throughout the day that there's a lot of people that leave for the day that go to their jobs, and there's this big reservoir of parking that can be used, right? And then there's also at nighttime, there's garages that go unused. Say our building, our current building right now that we park in, it's used during the day but not at night. And so we're hopefully going to get into a process over the next year to develop this platform where we can connect any single person to a public parking or to a garage and make it sort of public, but it would be possibly a transaction between two parties. We would just facilitate that.
And to add on to that, our current parking garages, we do provide monthly passes, but they're only on a month-by-month basis. They're not permanent restrictions because that would just, it is really intended to be shared. So we have monthly passes, and the percentage of monthly passes varies. We evaluate that constantly. So we're trying to get these garages as full as possible from all users. And so if there's not a lot of demand for people driving into downtown, then we want the spaces to be used by the surrounding residential and commercial development. So there is monthly parking passes available, but it's a fine balance between that and public. It's a public parking garage that you can come in if you just happen to be coming downtown for the day.
Any other questions? Should we move to Fred? Sure.
Well, not while you transition to that, so the cycle track, you basically say this park project or interfaces doesn't preclude the cycle track from happening at another it's not building the cycle track, it's
No.
basically.
Right, it just is adjacent, and so.
Allowing that adjacent, or facilitating that adjacent use, that's a different project.
Right, and its location is key to that because people from different neighborhoods and uptown, everything, can go and utilize the cycle tracks and get directly to the park site.
Right.
So it's a great location for that.
Okay, so I want to discuss, again, this is Ben Verdugo, Civic San Diego. I manage parking and mobility projects downtown. So a bit of background for those of you who don't know. Fred's a 5-passenger all-electric fleet of 17. We're planning on expanding to 20 this month. It's free to the public. Users can request through their smartphone where they can hit it on the screen. And the initial and ongoing funding of Fred comes through parking meter revenue, so it is a public program. And it's a good way that the parking district reinvests the money back into the footprint of downtown. It is an ADA compliant service, and we operate 7 days per week. As you guys know, there are questions whether the eligibility of this project itself. The award of $300,000 coupled with our commitment of $250,000 would fund 10 additional vehicles. Sandec staff pointed to a couple of documents regarding guidelines for the San Diego region. One that we reviewed was planning and designing for pedestrians, model guidelines for the San Diego region regarding transit section 3.7. The 3.71 discloses retrofitted an existing circulation system. Changes can be made within the right-of-way that can mend a disconnected system. Section 3.7.5, transit access. The neighborhood may have formidable barriers to disconnect the street pattern that greatly increases the actual walking distances and connections to the facility. And we feel that Fred does serve a really important first and last mile option to people using transit coming downtown. It's not always easy to get off a bus station or transit station and get to where you want to go, but we help make that connection. We also align with SGIP goals and objectives. Improving the public realm in combination create great places, advancing mobility, hub concepts, and leveraging advanced technologies. Contributing to the reduction of GHG emissions and vehicle miles traveled, improving public health by encouraging travel by means other than single occupant vehicles. And then fund proposed capital projects that are ready to go. And by ready to go, we're going to be in our 3rd year come August. And so this is a program that we have an agreement with a private operator through 2021. We have a possibility of 4 or 5 year extensions. So we want to see this as in the long haul of a really nice micro transit system downtown that complements other forms of transit. And we want to drive the point home that this is a capital investment. We talked about first and last mile option. We also, and Brad talked to this about the Park Once concept. There's a lot of people like me that commute to downtown in their automobile. they're able to leave their car parked at their place of employment and attend meetings by using Fred. And so it's a good first and last mile, but also the Park Once concept is true to this as well. We want to drive home the point that vehicles will be owned by the parking district as well. And then also we'll continue to fund this district through parking meter revenues. Fred highlights to date, total riders 250,000. We were averaging 12,500 riders per month. We actually had our biggest month in May at 14,000 riders. We have over 400,000 vehicle miles traveled, 20,000 gallons of gas saved, and 174 metric tons of CO2 emissions saved. There's some equivalencies down there as well as what that relates to. So with the expansion of 10 additional vehicles, we project that ridership will increase to about 25,000 riders per month, and a ridership of approximately 300,000. Gas saved per year will increase from 10,000 to 20,000, and the annual CO2 emissions saved will increase from 88 to 176. We understand this isn't a shovel-to-ground project, but it is really important for transportation needs of downtown San Diego. That concludes my presentation, and happy to answer any questions you may have.
Here's, do you happen to know what the operating cost per month is? You mentioned it.
It's about 90% of that is paying our drivers, and we operate through a living wage, and so it's about $100,000 a month to operate that, and so we fund that through parking meter revenues to help fund that program.
So it's in the vicinity of $10 per rider per month, sort of.
Correct. Yeah, we think we
simplistically do that.
Yes, we think we can get lower once our efficiency is improved. We've actually retrofitted our batteries in our cars right now where we can keep them on the road for longer. And so by that means that people will have much more luck getting rides. It's been an issue with supply and demand. There's a lot of people that want to use the service, but it's a matter of how many cars are on the road right now. So once we increase efficiencies, we think we can probably get down to 7 or 8 per rider possibly.
The concern with this is that it's not an infrastructure project.
Yes.
And can I ask you a question? Is there anything within the guidelines that explicitly state that this sort of system is not eligible, or is it just it doesn't fit within the parameters of the guidelines?
I think this is probably the reason why we're bringing it up as a group, as something that we want to evaluate, is that if you look at the eligibility project list, there isn't a, these are excluded. This is the Transnet ordinance, this is the intent, these are the program goals and objectives, these are eligible projects that we've seen and know to be eligible. This one isn't one that we've seen before, and it isn't one that's specifically called out as eligible or ineligible, and that's why we really lean to the ITALC to make that determination or advise on that determination. Ultimately, the board will take action.
The other type of project, ride-sharing programs, though we've been, the one in Coronado?
That's a different grant
those are
program.
Senior, was that that specifically for seniors, wasn't it?
Yeah, so Sandec has multiple grant programs.
I was
The
just wondering if
Specialized
there's
Transportation Grant Program is separate from this program and funds transportation.
So there's no other programs besides this program that this could possibly fit into, I mean, as far as transit funding?
Interesting question. I believe Fred may be eligible for a different grant funding, although the specialized transportation is specifically to serve seniors and individuals with disabilities. It does have a minimum eligibility that 80% of your target population is senior and
I got that. I just was wondering if
disabilities.
there's other grants. I was just wondering if
Fred is open to the public, so probably wouldn't qualify.
I guess my sense is this is the type of thing that Antonin Scalia would say should not be approved per the language that's written in the ordinance. But it also strikes me that if one looks at what the ordinance says and the sort of the spirit behind it, that Fred actually lines up pretty well with what I think the objectives would likely to have been in the minds of people had they foreseen this type of thing being available. So I don't know if it's stepping too far outside our purview, but given the option, I guess I would be supportive of Fred, because to me it more clearly relates to the objectives that I think people have in mind. the St. Joseph's project, even though it seems like a good neighborhood project, I agree with you, it just seems less clear, and it's a little bit more of a struggle for me.
When I don't know if there are people here to answer this, but when Sandec or a transit agency proposes a new bus route infrastructure to, say, bus gateway or something, and the buses need to be purchased, are they counted as infrastructure, or are they somehow in a separate program? Could be.
There's a couple different ways you can
I guess I'm
categorize
just-
it. It is a capital expense.
Right, that's kind of.
Yeah, for
We
sure,
consider
but-
it rolling stock. It is property.
Is that, I mean, the way I'm reading this is, you know, it's infrastructure, transit, and other smart growth supporting infrastructure, and, you know, if you were doing a new bus route, you need a new bus for.
Right, so in those other programs, rolling stock is part of your capital project.
Right.
And it does have a different line item within the budget, but it is
But
part
it's
of
still
the.
part of the capital outlay
Yeah.
to get the route running.
Right.
I guess that's what, I'm saying I'm a supportive way, I guess it's I would see it as, maybe it's not technically what we would view as the track or the road that the infrastructure rides on, but it's an immediate initial investment to go.
We do make a distinction, new rolling stock versus replacement. If it's replacement, then it's,
Maintenance.
yeah, it becomes something else. Yeah.
It's interesting comment. This would open the door. I mean, this type of transportation is all over the place. So it'd be interesting to see if you got away from the infrastructure improvements and went to this, you'd have a lot of folks, a lot of private companies just trying to get money, get grants. That'd be interesting to see how this would play out. Because there's a lot of companies that are providing this kind of service.
Well, I guess, you know, my perspective is that, you know, sort of with all respect, one of the issues Sandec has with regard to the public is being viewed somewhat as a very, you know, kind of auto-centric, build road-centric kind of agency. And it just strikes me that, and I don't know what public polling is, if you've done any, but, you know, Fred is a really good example of something that's very innovative in terms of the last mile solution. And, you know, frankly, I just think it would be sort of a good thing for Sandec vis-a-vis the public to be supporting that kind of innovation. And for all the metrics that are presented, I think it aligns well with the goal. So, again, personally, I think this is one where maybe sort of stepping outside the box a little bit would be a good thing. You know, if it were a vote, and I'm not sure if we actually are supposed to be voting on this, or you're just looking for feedback. It's
Just looking for
listed as a
feedback.
discussion item. I guess I would emphasize those couple of points. I think this, you know, Fred is the kind of innovation that Sandec would want to be, both in substance and in perception, supporting. The other project for me personally is just a little bit of a tougher call, but that's where I
agree with you on Fred. On the first project, as planner, I mean, it's difficult to do smart growth, and I think, you know, adding the parking component to a park component and potentially having shared parking, that the shared part is the key for me. I agree with you guys. If it's just a parking structure, then you're not really emphasizing alternative forms of transportation, but with the potential for shared parking, I think it becomes more of a reality. Maybe somebody, a resident, can use it, commute to wherever they may commute to, using trolley, train, ride or bike, who knows. But I'm just one voice on that, and as a planner, I just think it's hard. Smart growth is, the city says do smart growth, and then you have all these other components that you have to meet, and it's not always easy to do all the pieces.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. This is the Smart Growth Incentive Program. So while we may feel that these are great projects, I think the question before us is whether or not it's eligible for this funding. I don't think Sandec is in the position to be like, oh, this isn't a great project, or this is a good project. As I mentioned, we got 55 applications, all of them really great, worthy projects. We're just asking for weighing in on eligibility.
I think we're stuck with this definition of infrastructure improvements. I mean, I think that tells you pretty much where this is about. So the eligibility isn't really there. You really stick with the language.
Well, again, that's what I'm just saying.
Yeah,
I think
Yeah.
this is the type of thing where I think getting too caught up in the language isn't furthering the goal, in my opinion. So I don't dispute the fact, that's why I said Scalia would say it's clearly not eligible, but, you know, others think of these things differently. So we have a bit of a divided.
My assumption is you would
Next
just
steps
take
would just be relaying
comments.
all of your comments to the, we did go to the Transportation Committee for draft recommendations. We'll go to them again and ask them to make a recommendation to the Board of Directors, and then ultimately the Board of Directors has the final call and approving awards. So we're just collecting your feedback to pass on to the Transportation Committee and then to the board.
Stuart, to your comment, I don't think we're divided. I think I'm the only one that sees St. Joseph as being eligible or comfortable saying that I would be in support of it. It sounded like the Fred, definitely. I think Stuart's right. Let's not get caught up in the language. The intent is there, and I think it'd be a great thing to get behind.
Well, I'm probably more comfortable with that part than I was when I first started. I think I got some questions answered that helped. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Number 10, the Local Street and Road Program Annual Status Report. Alex.
Because it politicizes it sort of. That it just jumped out at me right then. It just jumped out at me. That's the debate. Is like the documents versus
Hi, good morning. Alex is here with the Operations Department, and with me is Dean City San Marcos Deputy City Engineer. He is also our Cities and County Transportation Advisory Committee Chair. So the item before you is an informational item, and it's the 5th Transit Local Streets and Road Program Annual Report. If you recall, we do this every year, and it's based on information provided by the local agencies. So local agencies submit a template, and that's included as attachment 1 of the staff report, I believe, starting on page 53. With that, in terms of the brief history, the basis for the report is part of the FY 2012 Transit Triennial Performance Audit Report, recommendations 3 through 6 that focus on having Sandec take a larger role in monitoring and reporting on the Local Streets and Road Program. If you recall, dating back to 2013, Mr. Tibbetts was the lead for these recommendations and working through CTAC. And based on your guidance and direction, we developed these templates. So we issue these templates every year and request information to be submitted. But before you is the 2017 information and just some key highlights as included in the staff report. Through this period, there was approximately 517 central line miles of pavement improvements, and that included rehab, resurfacing of pavement overlays. And other key highlights through this year including some roadway widening projects. We have El Camino Real for the city of Escondido, Carlsbad, excuse me, Plaza Boulevard, and within the city, National City. And then there's also some ongoing work for improvements on traffic signal operations for the city of Carlsbad. They're enhancing their traffic signal systems to an adaptive system. But let me just walk you through, again, through kind of maybe the template, and then just take a look at the first template. Again, it's attachment 1, page 53, and we'll do City of Carlsbad only because that's the first one in the attachment. So the template is divided in 3 sections, and we request this level of information from all local agencies. So the first section is Section A, and we ask for the local agencies to submit some key highlights of what they've accomplished for that particular year. Some agencies, we've also started requesting photos or key highlights of key projects. But for the city of Carlsbad, let's just see, for example, project number 1, they reference the fact that they've obviously worked on the El Camino roadway, Real roadway winding project, which they list about approximately $900,000 was used to complete that project for the local streets and roads funds. Also, project number 8, again, just highlighting that one, they reference the ongoing work for the traffic signal adaptive system, which they used $550,000 of transit funds for that project. We also asked the local agencies to submit kind of the okay within that year, which are the projects that were actually completed. And again, the city of Carlsbad lists the El Camino road project. And then the final section, we asked them to give us a look ahead at what the level of effort would be for the next fiscal year, FY18. If 2018, and for example, the city of Carlsbad, they reference some roadway operation improvements that are going to be going on, which is projects, again, just highlights 2 and 3, which they're going to be doing some right and left turn lane improvements for the Palomar Airport Road at Paseo del Norte. The final 2 sections of the template and information is giving an opportunity to for local agency to list any challenges and opportunities. And specifically the first section, and this is something that we kind of asked them and evolved over time. We want to make sure if they had any issues with spending down the road balances. Overall, from all those that submitted, there was no issue in spending down their balances. In fact, I know that Michelle comes to all of you on a quarterly basis. Our last quarterly transit financial report for the period ending on March 31st, all the local agencies met their 75% threshold that ITOC set for the local agencies. That pretty much kind of provides a brief summary of the information provided. If you have any specific questions on some of the templates, staff can follow up with the local agencies and have them submit that information. Or we could also ask them to come back at a future ITOC meeting. That pretty much concludes, but Ed and I are here to answer any questions. Obviously, Ed's been keen making sure that we all stay on track with the level of information supported by the local agencies.
I've always thought this report was needed years ago, and it's good. The question I had was Oceanside. I know that, and usually when you see there's no concerns or challenges, it's always good to see on most of these. But their comment about the 30% allocation for maintenance. Are we? I can't remember. Are we looking at?
That's the recommendation for the triennial report.
And is that we're going to be doing that this year, next year, as far as?
I can look at that. CTAC has formed an ad hoc committee to actually look at that issue, and that along with some other things. So we will be looking at that over about the next 9 months. Is trying to at least come up with a recommendation from the committee on whether to keep it, whether to modify it.
It'll be interesting if the SB $1 really start flowing. I imagine that like I said, that may not be an issue if they really start seeing a lot of cash come in for maintenance for roads on SB 1. You don't have to rely on as much.
Those of us that kind of program those internal dollars or those external sources of funding, they come with limitations. And we'll program projects based on those limitations and those requirements. But in a perfect world, we would like to simplify it. So there's people on the committee that would look at the 70-30 isn't a problem. And there are other cities that the 70-30 split really kind of hinders their effort. So we'll come back to you in about 9 months, though.
Do we even have, does the ordinance even allow any flexibility in that? I don't think so. So they could come back and ask for, what would you come back?
So the first meeting we had was last week, and that was the first question that was asked. So the Sandec staff will be reporting back what modifications can be made and what are the requirements if we do make those recommendations, if they are to move forward, or are there other methods that we could choose or recommend that would accomplish the same thing.
You're within that framework.
Well, I imagine at some point your report comes to here, something like that, and then staff does a report to us, and then we would make a recommendation. If we wanted to see a potential change, that would have to go to the board for, that change can only be done by the board, right?
Right.
Is that
Yeah.
the
So essentially, what we're doing is, the auditor came out with, a number of recommendations. One of those was the 73, and so we're working with CTAC, to hear from the people that are using and these dollars and implementing these projects. Okay, what is it that you're looking for that would help you? Different cities have different needs, right? But if any of the recommended changes require, let's say, an ordinance amendment or something like that, then it would be up to the board with a 2/3 vote to do that.
So we started that work by getting through that last week, part of the recommendation number 11, which is having CTAC and internal groups figure out what is it that we want to do for 7:30. So we just initiated that work, and you guys will hear from us probably within 9 months.
That's great.
So I had two questions. One of which relates to correct me if I'm wrong, but there's actually an ability to, or there's a standard sort of scoring of roadway quality, isn't there? Right. And so, and I remember, again, going through the Triangle Performance Report, one of the things that we talked about was, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that it's not clear that all the jurisdictions have the ability, and I don't know if it's a budgetary or actual machine that does this, or how it gets done, to actually do the scoring for all of their roadways. Am I correct in that?
So just in background and context, we went through this extensive effort through this process where, and I recall that a lot of the local agencies do have a method or process in place to capture payment conditions. And it's generally focused on the PCI, payment conditions index. Payment condition index. The dilemma that arose through the dialogue that we have with the local agencies is that process itself is not everybody follows the same methodology, or they have different reporting years. So at that time, we agreed to, hey, can we just provide that level of information in narrative form? Fast forward, one of the recommendations out of this recent audit report was, let's start looking at that.
Right.
But that's the essence of the background of the discussion. And I don't know if I want to speak in terms like, for example, individual agencies have different even though it's still a PCI, they have different methodologies of collecting the PCI. And the dilemma was that if you use a certain process for a larger city versus a smaller city, then we're not creating the appropriate picture or representation of what the transit dollars.
Yeah, recognizing all those complexities, I guess my question was the extent to which you would foresee including that scoring in here, because I think this does a fabulous job of fulfilling a lot of what Jonathan was looking for in terms of the activity, but it doesn't as much speak to the outcome, which the scoring would really be helpful for doing. So that was one part. The second question I had was, again, also in the context of the Triennial Review, I think it was a few years ago, there was a notion added, sort of when possible, doing any local street and road repair projects to also at the same time be doing active transportation projects in terms of bikeways and sidewalks. And that, I guess one of the things I recall the consultant coming back with is that there was sort of mixed results in terms of the reporting back of the various jurisdictions on the degree to which they were actually doing that. And so I'm wondering if, as part of this assessment, if trying to work on improving the responsiveness of that reporting would also be beneficial, because to the extent that you're doing this reporting on local street and roads, that's becoming an area that I think people are focusing more and more on.
No, in fact, I think that's one of the recommendations on that's the recent report recommendation. Again, I forget what's the ordinance or the compliance with the title. Sorry,
Is it 21?
21.
Okay, so that's also, then you would
That's
characterize
also
that
being
it's on the
considered
drawing
that we're going to
board.
be looking at. Correct.
Okay, great, thank you.
I was gonna say that's one of the ones that didn't actually have any requirement, and we would like to, so people weren't knowing what they were doing, and we weren't getting the input, correct?
Well, no, there is a requirement for, for reasonable accommodation.
Yes, right, it's sort of a best efforts requirement.
Right, and so, but I think it's more of, setting goals and then measuring against those goals and then reporting against, or reporting whatever the outcomes might be. I think that's what the auditor was focusing on.
Yeah.
It's recommendation number 12, and it deals with that level of information under Title 21. And that's something, in fact, that, again, the ad hoc group started having those internal discussions as well. How do we report to that as
Great.
well, within the realm of all the other recommendations?
Thank you.
I think this has been good since we got to this format, and it's a lot easier to see what's going on.
And it's something, I just wanted to add, this format was sort of the first attempt, because the auditor has been asking for, what are you getting out of the local streets and roads program, right? And so this was the first attempt, and working with CTEC, this format is what was, agreed to in terms of reporting. The reviewer, or excuse me, the auditor has looked at this format, and they say, well, this provides some information, but you guys, Sandec, need to do more in terms of, working with the locals to set goals, and then to measure against those goals, and then to report to the public what is it that the program is accomplishing, not just in terms of, number of lane miles paved or lineal feet of sidewalk or whatever, but what is that accomplishing?
Yeah, we had a lot of discussion in the performance audit committee about the difference between activities and outcomes.
Right.
Right, and so this is exactly that point.
Yep.
Thank you guys very much. 10B is the local street and road output and outcome report. Sue.
Okay. In 2015, Transit Performance Audit made a recommendation to expand on the outpush data, which Alex just provided. Staff working with CTAC developed a proposed format and began collecting data in the RTIP database on planned outcomes and proposed outputs for the Transnet projects. The proposed version of this report was developed and presented to ITOC in July of 2016 to coincide with the biennial update of RTIP. While entering projects for the 2018 RTIP, local agencies were asked to update their proposed outputs and outcomes for the first 2 years of the next RTIP period, or fiscal years 19 and fiscal year 20. This report summarizes those proposed outputs per the categories of congestion and relief maintenance as defined in Board Policy 31 and the outcomes of these efforts. Page 3 of the report is a summary of all the outputs and outcomes and shows that almost 73% of planned local street and road programming for the next 2 years will benefit congestion relief efforts, with Transnet dollars leveraging almost 24% of other funds available to local agencies. That includes federal funds, gas tax, SB1, developer impact fees, and general fund dollars. Page 4 shows more detailed information for congestion relief projects. And this includes the number of projects per category, the amount of Transnet funds, and then other funds that are programmed for those projects, and the proposed output, which varies by type of improvement. Then the same information is shown for maintenance projects beginning on page 7. So, this is for your information. I don't know if there's any questions.
So this was sort of the expanded attempt at trying to capture what the auditor was asking us to do. And so, the auditor has reviewed, the report that was under item 10A, and now what we're doing under item 10B, and they're saying, okay, all of this is fine, we need to do more. And so that's what we're working with the CTAC to, okay, how are we going to collect more? But not only that, what's the level of effort? How much is it going to cost? And does the board in the local jurisdictions, you know, how do they feel about sort of the additional cost and effort, and, you know, to do that, you know, versus, you know, the information we would be getting out of it. So that's sort of in the next step.
My first instinct is I want to know, when you're doing new roadways that increases capacity and there's 3 projects, or excuse me, roadway widening and there's 13 projects, is it all in the city of San Diego? Is it?
I was going to ask the same question.
Like, how are they spread around the member agencies? And I don't know if you have that information.
17 lanes added was my question. Where is that's the same line. 13 projects, 17 lanes added.
Yeah.
I'm just curious what those are, what those projects are. Those lanes.
And
Is that the I-5?
No,
This is
no,
not-
these are local streets
These
and
are local
roads.
streets and roads.
So, I
I
mean,
assume that
we
goes to
could,
Jose's comment of level of effort, right? For the cities or
What's
for
that?
staff.
we could provide that information, we could.
Presumably this is just a
give you
summary, you know,
detailed
this is
breakdown.
just a summary.
This is
Yeah.
the summary, yeah.
But the more difficult one, I think, is, you know, if you look at outcomes, the question is to what degree are you going to be able to measure
Yes.
with, you know, really,
That's where it
real
gets a little
way.
bit.
Right.
That starts getting more difficult because, you know, outcome reduces congestion. Well, it's a kind of a desired outcome. The question is, can you statistically show what's happening? And particularly in the context of pedestrian safety, because that was one of the, you know,
One of the
unfortunate
areas.
problem areas that we've actually had
Right.
worsening instances of pedestrian accidents. So that natural measurement of that would be helpful, but that starts getting, I should imagine, quite costly and difficult. But hopefully you find a way to get there.
Hopefully.
The traffic calming one, I wonder if that's, Mr. Chairman, if that's one of the Del Mar projects or not.
Probably.
Right there at the fairgrounds.
Yeah. It works remarkably well. I thought it was going to be a problem and we were going to have backups, but problem.
Yeah, so, I mean, if you'd like, we could print out the detailed listing of.
I'm just curious.
Okay.
When it says lanes added, I guess, is that actually a new lane that was constructed
Yes.
on a city road?
Right.
And some of those, I believe, are bridge ends. Sure.
I'm trying to think as an example
Bridge
of one.
widenings.
Trying to think is, like, Escondido, doesn't it have
How come?
Bear
that's
Valley
what you know,
Parkway?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the projects coming up. I mean,
That's true.
Altamira was one of those where they like.
Yeah.
The areas that I drive around,
Yeah.
it just seems weird to realize that.
There's several projects in the county where they're widening.
Must be the county.
Yeah.
Yeah, the more established cities probably won't have none.
City of San Diego is doing the Vita La Valle. They're going from 2 to 4 lanes from El Camino Real to basically I-5, San Andreas Drive, right by the fairgrounds. Yeah,
Oh.
they'll add lanes. Any other questions? I like this. I mean, yeah, I want the detail, but also it's a nice snapshot of
Yeah,
everything getting done.
I don't need any detail. I
Okay.
just was curious what 17 lanes added sounds.
Well, I mean, the actual draft architect will have all that detail in it. It doesn't show the outputs in the project reports, but it's pretty obvious. It says it's adding lanes. Thank you.
Back to me again. All right, so we just wanted to let you know, and I think all of you know already, you know, there's going to be a vacancy here in the ITOC. So today is Caitlin Arduino's last day. She was hoping to make it today, but a couple weeks away from maternity leave, so she's really busy trying to wrap things up. So, so in order to backfill the position, you know, I just wanted to let you know what we're doing. We're actively recruiting, and Her position is for the real estate, land economics, or right-of-way acquisition expertise within the ITOC. And so essentially what we're doing is we're just advertising through newspapers, our regional, it's called e-region newsletter, so it's broadcast out to all the people on our mailing lists, as well as working through the chamber, the regional EDCs, and professional organizations tied to real estate. Caitlin is also assisting by distributing the notice of the vacancy through memberships in real estate development associations. So, you know, we ask, you know, yourselves as well to help us spread the word. The position, right now the application period closes on June 25th. So far we haven't received any applications, so we're hopeful that, you know, with increased, you know, awareness that we will get people interested and that they will apply.
Putting on the agenda today probably reached a lot more people.
I'm just, the public notice presumably is already in use. The one thing I'm wondering if it might be relevant to going forward, just make reference to the fact that it's a monthly meeting commitment. That's the one thing that just sort of, I don't know, maybe that turns people off more than hurts.
We don't want to tell them that.
Hopefully anybody applying knows that, would figure that out quickly.
Okay.
And so, assuming that you get applications in by June 25th, some people would you actually be in a position to have somebody join for the July meeting? Because we tend not to meet in August.
Probably not for the July meeting, because once, so that the application period closes June 25th, we have to go through a screening committee process to make sure that they have the right qualifications. And then it goes to an interview process with a subcommittee of the board. And so I believe that's scheduled, oh, it's not here, I believe that's scheduled for the July meeting. We try to schedule it around board meetings when they're all
Got
here.
it.
So the first opportunity would likely be the September, or the August meeting, assuming we meet in August, if not in September.
Got it, okay.
Thanks very much for that.
I'm just curious, when you have a vacancy, like six, there'll be six of us, what's the quorum? Still, it would still be four, right?
Yes?
Yeah. How that works.
Yes.
All right, on to our last item, the 7-point data accuracy and modeling work plan update.
I'm here, as you requested, to go over this.
Thank you.
Did you guys want to take a break before we start? Because this is a long one.
I need to use the restroom.
Yeah, so.
Is this something you're going to be doing for the board as well, or have done already, or?
Go, okay. So this presentation is an update on the 7-point plan. We did this presentation to the board at the November board meeting. And the 7-point plan was then, aspects of it were rolled into what is now known as the Plan of Excellence. So that's more of an agency-wide initiative going forward. So I'm going to kind of show you how that all worked out. So the first thing that we did, obviously this all goes back to the forecast error that we found that gave us an inflated amount of revenue that we may have generated for Measure A. So that was brought to everyone's attention. And then there were really two directives that fed into the Plan of Excellence. And the first one, the 7-point plan, sorry. First was the board directive, which was to figure out what had happened. So that's where the 7-point plan came from. And it was really an assessment of the errors, an evaluation of the processes that we used at the time. So like, how did the errors occur? To implement some type of data governance plan, as well as to have our information looked at by experts rather than just reviewing things internally. And then there was the external investigation, which was Houston Hennigan, and they brought up issues of data quality, QA, QC, transparency, the culture here at Sandec, as well as staffing issues. And so what I did with my group is to go through and to take those, essentially those two documents, and we did a lot of work over the last year. We came up with new mission, vision, and value statements. So for instance, we did a lot of soul searching in terms of what is it that we're trying to do as a group, and our vision is really to be the San Diego region's most trusted and progressive information source. So that is what our vision is. And our mission really is to regain trust in Sandec's data and analytics. So that's what I have all of the people in my group focused on doing. And then we also came up with a set of values as to how we were going to do this and integrate it into the organization. We also took a look at what the best practices were in terms of data and analytics. We created a 4-tiered peer process, review process, whereby the work that we do and the work that others do within the agency are looked at by people from the outside, so that we can get a better understanding as to whether or not we're doing the analysis correctly. And I can talk more about that if you're interested in it. We also looked at all of our processes and we did assessments of them, and then we reorganized the entire tech services group. All of those things feed into what is now known as the Plan of Excellence, and this is what we'll be bringing to you next week, or next month, sorry. And the Plan of Excellence is really taking what was a departmental initiative and moving it to the agency level. So some of our stuff is included in here, like data governance and regional forecasting processes. Those things are now part of the agency's Plan of Excellence, but it also includes things like the independent performance audits and stakeholder communication. So it's broader than just necessarily the tech services group, which was the group we were looking at. And so we'll give you a lot more information on this. The reason I wanted to show you this is that this work doesn't go away. It has evolved into something else that we've been working on in the last couple of months. So I thought I'd take a step back and just really look at, well, who is the technical services department? It's really the department that's responsible for all of the data, research, analytics, and modeling within the agency. There are 18 members who are part of the ARGIS team, and ARGIS is the ones that collect all of the criminal justice data and the police reports. There are 12 in criminal justice, which do a lot of the analysis of crime data. There are 10 people who are in transportation modeling. There were 13 people who were in data and software development, and there were 7 who were in economics and demographic research. So that's kind of the composition of the group. The interesting thing is that most of the data that this agency uses comes out of this group, and I'll go into that a little bit more. So there's about 60 total staff in my department. So when you look at the Sandec Technical Services Department, what are they responsible for? There are 86 different sources of data that come into the agency. Things like from the Department of Finance, we get numbers from EDD, we get numbers from the police departments, for instance, feeding in information on crime data. So all that comes in. We have all the land use data, and that's kind of the core of the information that we use. We have over 200 internal databases that this data is fed into, and the size of that data is about 77 terabytes. And that includes all of our AVM, or the activity-based model, which is the transportation model. There are 7 million lines of code that we use that need to be QA'd essentially that retrieve all of this data and do the calculations on top of it. We have 205 servers that have the data contained on them, and we have 64 web applications that put data out into different websites and to different hooked to different member agency things. A lot of that has to do with mapping data too. So we're responsible for a lot of stuff. And so when something went wrong, like the forecast, figuring out where it lived or where it happened, it was a relatively large task. But so what my group is doing now is we're trying to gain control of this, which is the data asset. So the goal of the 7-point plan was to take a look primarily to determine what other variables in the model were impacted by the error. So if you think about it, there was a mistake, okay? So the question is, how deeply was that embedded within all of that stuff that I just showed you? So the first step was to figure out where the error was and if anything else was impacted. And then, if other things were impacted, we went out to find all the documents and reports that may have had this erroneous data, and then figure out what we were going to do with it, whether we needed to change the data, take some kind of corrective action, redo the report for the customer, et cetera. So that was the second step. And those are kind of both backward looking, okay? So that was the error, and then fix the error and figure out what the ramifications are, and fix that. And then going forward, it was really to develop new processes and procedures to minimize potential errors going into the future, whether it's our data, our analytics, or our modeling. That was the goal of the 7-point plan. I'm going to go through each one of the 7 points, just give you the highlights of what happened in them, so you can see to understand what happened. The first thing was to conduct this detailed review. So we conducted the detailed review. We traced back, and I think I showed you how we went back and actually found where we did this spreadsheet error in one of the original. It was a cut and paste error that fed the data that went into the forecast. So we looked at that. We traced it through, and we found that the error was limited to the output data, which impacted wages, income, and taxable retail sales. Taxable retail sales is the variable that was used to calculate the Measure A numbers. That's how that was related. There were no real significant effects to the demographic data, like for instance the population, housing, or employment projections, and that's primarily because those data are controlled to or tied to Department of Finance control totals. So we kind of know what the population is going to be. So it's a different model. It's not exactly hooked up, and they have different control totals. So it didn't affect the major variables that we use for forecasting purposes. So we found specifically that there were inflated industry outputs in 3 out of DEFN's 50 economic sectors, and that was with the cut and paste where it was shifted. And so things like some of the manufacturing industry was overestimated. We found that population, housing, and employment were insulated from these errors because it really is a separate model. It's tied to different control totals. And in the process, we discontinued using DEFM for any type of forecast or analysis as we moved forward. We used independent forecasts up until we came up with the new Series 14 forecast. And we spent a lot of time working at replacing it with simpler and easier to manage tools. And so the forecasting tools that we have now, much more transparent, and we're not writing all of them in-house anymore. So for our short-term forecast, we've contracted with Beacon Economics, who is a very reputable economics firm, to do the short-term economic forecast. We work with Muni Services, who helps us with all of our sales tax revenue to work on our sales tax forecast. We use DOF numbers as control totals across the top. So we're a lot less likely to have any type of issues now because we're using a lot of third-party independent sources, bringing them together in the models that we do.
As part of that, have you launched an initiative to also try to minimize the use of Excel spreadsheets as a place where you are actually...
Yes. So exactly. So the new modeling tools that we have are written in SQL, and all of the queries are done using code rather than using spreadsheets. Now that doesn't mean that people don't still take the data and then do analysis in the spreadsheet.
But that wouldn't touch the institutionalized data.
It won't anymore.
Yeah.
So that, and there are still places, to be candid, that we have Excel spreadsheets embedded in key processes, like for instance in our ABM model, which the forecast data is then fed into the ABM or the transportation model, but it's fed in using spreadsheets right now. So we have to replace that, and after we're done with this cycle of regional plan, we'll be working at taking those places that are highly likely to have, risk areas and replacing them with code. But we need people to write that too. But the forecast stuff now is all written in SQL, and it's all code-based retrieval. Even a lot of our graphs now are tied directly to the SQL queries rather. So even if we're producing the graph in Excel, it's using a SQL query to get the data from the database, so that you can't make changes in the Excel document and then have the graph accidentally change. So there's things like that we're doing too. Now, in terms of the dependency analysis, so we looked at, we found the errors and we looked at what happened, and they really only affected financial projections. And we corrected the work products where we found those errors. And like for instance, I said the income data was fed into the activity-based model. We found that was an error. We changed it. And we looked at a bunch of other documents too. We examined 179 Sandec documents to figure out if there was any other connection back to these financial data. And in some cases, we did find that there was, for instance, there was data that was reported and it's in an appendix of a report, but there wasn't, a decision wasn't made using that data. So then we didn't touch that. There were areas, however, like for instance, the household income forecast was available on Data Surfer, which is one of the websites where we provide information to the public. So what we did is we took that off the website. So you can no longer get income forecasts off of our website. I'm not comfortable with redoing the forecast for the old series. So instead of fixing it and then putting up yet a different set of income numbers, we've just taken it off completely. So now you can just get demographics, ethnic categories, housing units, that type of stuff from our website. The household income forecast used in ABM were corrected, as I said, and then as far as we know, all of the known issues have been addressed. Now, with that said, things do every once in a while pop up, and then we're back trying to chase down why that happened. But we have, like I said, 7 million lines of code that some of them use this data, and we're still finding little things that happen every once in a while. So, step 3 was to develop a comprehensive flow diagram to show the interaction between our modeling components. And this really hadn't been done here at Sandec, which is to kind of like put onto a picture. It's like, what is it that we're all working on and how is it all related? Everybody knows how to hand off their thing to the next person. So what we did is we ended up mapping out the entire flow of all of the databases. So the databases are the ones that are located kind of on the left of this screen, and they feed into all of the modeling. And so the graphic on the right side represents all of the different models that we use and how it uses the data. So we kind of now have a comprehensive understanding of how the data flows through everything. So if we do find an error somewhere, we can more easily trace it back. So like if there's an error in, let's just say we find something in the ABM model, we can trace back how and which file the error would have happened in, and which data file that would have happened in, and then we can fix it at the source rather than trying to patch it at the end. So that was the third thing that we did. In terms of data governance, we surveyed the agency to understand and document how the data is disseminated through the agency, and so that we can really start to implement agency-wide coordination. What we found during that survey, and again, part of our problem is that came out of all of this reporting, is that the modeling team was unaware that the numbers were used to do the forecast for Measure A. They had no idea that that had happened. And so what happened was Marnie asked for a copy of the forecast information, so they sent it to him, and then he took the numbers from the forecast and he gave Gary or whoever was in charge of Measure A the numbers that were in the forecast. The two groups really never talked about the fact that this was being used for Measure A. And and it was really clear. It's like, well, Marnie asked for the data, we gave it to him. Marnie just used the data assuming it was right. So it's like there was no mistake, there's no error really, in calculations when it came to calculating that forecast. But the fact is that the two groups didn't talk to each other, and had they, we possibly could have avoided this issue. What we found is that 3/4 of the data that we use at Sandec somehow originates within my team, within the tech services team. And 40% of the data that we use originates outside. So that's that we bring in data from other places, and then we manipulate it, or we create other data sets, and 75% of that is what's at Sandec. About half of the data was obtained informally. So there was no formal process by which, how do I get the forecast? So this was Marnie sending an email to somebody, in this case I think it was Daniel, and Daniel sending the data back and not having any control. So one of the things that we did is we created a data analysis request form. So now anytime anyone requests data, whether it's internal or external, we have a record of that. So we go into a form online and we would type in this person requested the forecast data. Okay, and so then we would send them the forecast data. But now we know exactly what we sent to who, and what version we sent. And that way, if we find another error, we can go through this log and we can say, oh, we sent the bad data to these 5 people, and then we can quickly go in and fix the problem if there is one. So that's the data analysis and requesting tracking form. And we also put out an RFP for data governance, and through that RFP, we've now hired a consultant who's come in, and they're looking at data governance not only within my group, but this is a much larger issue. It's kind of a Sandec-wide issue. So Ray Trainer's group, who runs operations, they collect a tremendous amount of data when it comes to the tolling and that type of thing. So it's a joint effort between our 2 groups, and between our 2 groups, we probably have 95% of the data that Sandec creates. And so we're working at data governance from an agency-wide level, and then we've also recruited a database administrator to make sure that all of our data sets are taken care of, they're backed up, that they're documented, et cetera. So those are the things that we did in terms of data governance. And this is an ongoing process. This is not by any means finished. We're at the very beginning of this.
And I'm sorry, did you say, so have you actually hired, or you're in the process of searching?
We had a very difficult time finding somebody who was a DBA, qualified DBA, given the salary structure that we pay, given what the demand is out in the agency. So I had one of the people within my group who has a computer science background, and we assigned him as the DBA. So we now have a dedicated position for a DBA, whereas before he was working in the forecasting group. So now we have someone who knows how to do this stuff. The other thing is we looked at, or put together an expert review panel, and so we put together a nationwide expert review panel to take a look at our forecasting. And I just wanted to put this up so you can see how extensive it was. So, you know, the forecast is really the basis that drives much of what we do here at Sandec in terms of the forward-looking stuff. And so we had an expert review panel. We tried to balance it between research and academia, state and public agencies, and also the private sector. So we brought in people from all over the place. The names that are in blue are economists. The names that are in the green color are demographers. So we tried to get people who were broad in their fields also, and it's geographically dispersed too. So we brought all of these people in, and we had them take a look at our new forecasting methodology, the one that's going to be replacing the DEPA model. And their conclusions were that the long-term demographic methodology was sound. So what we were doing to predict out how many people the region would have, the global numbers, that was a sound methodology. But they had some suggestions that to improve the model, and we took all of these into account. One was that they thought that we needed a short-term economic model. So, you know, long-term demographic trends are focused on the number of births that we have, the number of deaths that occur, longevity of the population, et cetera, to give us numbers of people. But they felt it was very important for our forecast to have things on like different industries and how biotech is doing and growing, for instance, unemployment rates, those types of things in the short term. And so this is where we ended up contracting with Beacons Economics to do it, because quite frankly, we don't have the time or the skill set internally to be doing that type of forecasting. And so it's better that we bring in experts to give us that information, and then those data are used to feed into the rest of the model. They said that we should look at interregional commuting and migration patterns. This is a very difficult concept to capture, especially to try to understand what the flow is of people who come across the border and what the impact is. But those are things that we're working into the model, so there will be variables to measure that. They also suggested that we do forecasting in ranges rather than forecasting points. Now, a lot of the work that we do requires point forecasts. So, for instance, the DOF will tell us that we need to be within 1.5% of a point forecast, and we need point forecast for RENA and other things like that. So we'll always have a point forecast, but what we'll have also is a range around it that will help explain the uncertainty that's associated with that particular variable.
And to date, when I've seen ranges, it seems like you've just kind of, I don't mean to sound disrespectful and characterize it as a simple plus or minus 5%, but were you going to start doing more sophisticated statistical sort of variability?
Yes, so we've
on
done
the ranges.
This is like the economist nerd in me. My happy place was to do like all of the math on this. And for instance, with population, when we take a look at historical population from 1970 through 2012, the variation in that population range is plus minus 8%. Okay, so the simple way of doing that is to use a plus minus 8% cone, which as you take that out to 2050 is relatively wide. It's plus minus 300,000 people. So it actually is pretty broad, more than just using a 5%. We did a lot of this mathematically too, where we did regression analysis on it, and we had cones of uncertainty built. The truth is that the data is so variable in most cases that the cones don't make sense once you get out past 4 or 5 years. They start to get so wide that, like for instance with the population cone, if we look at all the variables that go into it, like for instance, and the biggest variable there is in migration. So there are years where we have a tremendous number of people who migrate into the region for economic opportunities, for instance, and there are times like during recessions where we have people, we actually lose population and people out-migrate. So when you take those things into account and you put a cone, your cone actually could be anywhere from decreasing population, like the region going to 3 million or the region going up to 6 million. And at that point, it's not giving you any type of confidence that, I mean, you know, you're forecasting basically a 100% difference in population. So what we've tried to do is to come up with cones that are meaningful, that are based on kind of the variability that we see in the trends, and those areas where we see larger variability will have larger cones, if that makes sense. And but to get like a 95% cone on these things would essentially mean that it's hard to interpret. It's like, well, if everything fell into alignment, you know, and for instance, birth rates decreased, death rates increased, and people out-migrated, then we have negative population growth. So a lot of things have to happen to get some of those extremes.
Yeah, I'm thinking more in terms of, like, for example, a plan of finance, and right, that's one where you just kind of, to be responsive here, you just included a plus and minus 5. But it's a little bit like, I don't know, you've probably seen those, will you have enough money at retirement,
yeah,
sort of forecastings that say, you know, at this level you'll have, you know, 60% probability, 70, you know, that type.
So for the cost side of it,
yeah,
what we
exactly,
did is we actually took a look at all of the components of the construction cost index. So we looked at concrete, asphalt, steel, the dirt removal, etc. So all of the components, and we did regression analysis, and we forecast 95% cone of confidence on that, so that when we do the cost analysis, or we gave it to Jose, he can see what the high and the low probabilities are, and what the midpoint is. That would be just like a straight line forecast through there. So in these particular cases, we've actually calculated it to the component level, and then we have an aggregate too. Again, construction costs have gone up so much in the last 2 years that we're outside the 95% confidence interval at 5 years. But with that said, we now have these cones so that from a planning perspective, we can see what might occur, right, high and low. And we've built a tool where an engineer can put in what their components are, like what percentage of their project is concrete versus steel versus the different components, and then it calculates an average cone also for them. So average.
Jose, a question for you, and this is a bit of a digression, I know, but so now that you've built in, as part of the presentation, the concept of uncertainty, let's call it, right, like risk, has the board started to confront the, you know, how do we deal with risk in terms of processes for thinking about what happens when we have, you know, downsides to, or, you know, excessive costs or downsides to revenue and that sort of thing? Because that's, to me, it seems like that's the real benefit of, it's not just the statistics for the sake of a better, you know, grade from your outside review board. It's to actually help the board in their decision making. And now that you're not using point estimates, the concept of risk to the forecast probably is much more visible to them. but that implies, decision-making processes to deal with risk.
Yeah.
You know what I'm
So
saying?
I think they're heading in that direction. Probably one of the biggest examples right now is the regional plan update, where we're going to be having, in fact, we've already presented revenue scenarios that are presented in range format. And that range is actually developed not for the overall figure, but we look at each individual revenue source that makes up the revenue forecast. Some of them are much more certain than others. And so the level of uncertainty is much narrower. For others it's wider, and for others it's even wider than that. And so depending on the relative size of each revenue source, you get sort of a composite range. So we are presenting that in terms of them using that sort of to do like risk assessment and that sort of thing. I think we're taking baby steps in that direction, but we're not quite there yet. But in terms of some concrete steps, we did propose and the board approved setting aside a program-wide contingency, because we realized that, even though each project has its own level of contingency, some of these larger projects have higher risk depending on where they are in the construction completion of those projects. And so we looked at those larger projects and we said, okay, this one has more risk than this other one. And depending on the relative size of each one, we figured out what would be an appropriate size for this agency-wide contingency reserve. And so we proposed it to the board, and the board approved setting aside, I think it's like $54 million as a agency-wide contingency reserve in case something happens. But that's taking that sort of that risk and then trying to mitigate for that risk.
So, yeah, and in addition to the forecast ranges, the other thing that we're moving towards is to have you could call it a bull and a bear scenario for the economy, so that we can, again, not just put out just a point forecast, but we'd also put out an optimistic and a more conservative forecast. We're working with our vendor Beacons to come up with that. Some of the challenges we face are like the environmental documents require a point forecast. So there's going to be one point that we're going to have to eventually say this is what we believe is going to happen in that year. But with that, we'll have a lot more information as to what the possible paths are based upon the uncertainty in the economy and the demographics. And the final growth forecast should be finished in 2019 at the same time the regional plan is finished. The next thing was transparency, and that was to develop processes and standards to communicate data, methods, and analysis in a clear and transparent manner. And there were three things that we looked at. It was data transparency, analytic transparency, and process transparency. And what we did to accomplish that really is this formalized peer review process that has 4 levels. So the lowest level of peer review would be an interdepartmental review. So that would be people within the tech services team, for instance, looking at the work of other people in tech services. And that's always to double check all the numbers that are going out. But there's a level 2, which would include, for instance, people from other departments taking a look at this. So if we're doing something for the planning department, we would ask them to review the data and the methodologies that we use so that they're comfortable with it too. A level 3 PRP, for instance, would be one that included outside agencies. So for instance, we've done work that impacted MTS and NCTD, and so we had representatives from them sitting while we reviewed the methodology that we were using to do the forecasting for them. And then the level 4 is where we have the experts who are unrelated to Sandec or the project come in and take a look at it. And we've done a couple of those. So when we were doing the cross-border traffic study, for instance, we called in people from all over the United States for a 2-day seminar. Basically, we showed them what we were doing, and they gave us feedback, and they gave us a list of things that we should be looking at. And so we're working through that to make sure that we have more accurate data. So the peer review process has also kind of taken on a life of its own within Sandec, and what's happened is that other departments are now asking to have us set up peer reviews for them, and they will bring a project that they're working on, and then we sit in this formal kind of a review panel. And the thing is, we take notes on it, we have all the documentation, it's all put up into a folder on the server, so that if ever somebody does a public records request, for instance, or asks, how did you check that data? We just have to go to there, and it has all the notes of what everybody said, who weighed in on it, et cetera. It also has all the calculations that were done. All the notes are put together. So that's all transparent now to anybody who wants to take a look at that. There's an escalation process that we need to work on a little bit more, but it's a process whereby the executive director would get information on things that might be happening that would impact. And right now the escalation process is, I meet with Kim every 2 weeks and I let her know anything that might be a problem. I think in the long run we'd like to formalize that a little bit more, but when we have a new ED, I think we'll be able to figure out how he or she would want to work with an escalation process. Then we also came up with Center of Excellence, 6 of them, one being the Visualization Center of Excellence, which is really to help us make it easier to understand the data. And this is something that you struggle with all the time too. It's like, we give you this table, it doesn't really, it's hard to interpret it, can we do it as a graph, that type of thing. So we're working proactively at trying to make the data easier to understand and use standard methodologies for visualization. And then the modeling disclosure documents, so a lot more documentation than we've done before. In the past, quite honestly, we've had documentation, but it's all been kind of an analyst documenting for themselves what they did. Now it's a much more formal process. And finally, formalizing all of the processes within the agents, or within my group for sure, and that's adjusting resources, schedule, scope, etc. So what we did here is I realigned the entire team so that we're no longer focused on the groups that I talked about, but we have a database group, we have people who are responsible for the actual content, which is creating the data, so there are processes in place there. They hand it off to analysts, and then we have a separate formal QA department and a formal project management department. So now there's separation between these people. It used to be that the modelers would do their own QA of their models, so all of that has been taken out. So in order to do that, we basically undid the entire agency, or my group, 60 people, so we reconfigured them. And so we hired some key staff positions. So we have the project management position. We moved several people into QA positions. We have approved in next year's budget permanent position for QA, permanent position for a program manager, so that we can keep everything on a schedule. And we're running things now from timelines, so that we can see what the impact is of decisions that are being made early on, or changes, and how that rolls out. So everything we're doing for the regional plan now is on a Microsoft project timeline. So all the groups have input into that. We're also assessing the software and data inventory. We have just about every flavor of software and data that you can get here. And so with Ray Trainer's group, what we're doing is we're trying to narrow down the technology stack that we're using. And so if we're a Microsoft shop, and so other things that are not Microsoft, for instance, you really have to make a good case for why you would have to have that tool. So in the past, it was kind of, we just bought different tools, and it led to a proliferation of visualizing or showing data using all sorts of different tools, and we didn't have expertise anywhere. We had generalists kind of using this stuff. We're really making a lot of changes over there. And then we're taking a look at the entire budget in terms of what it is that we're committing to versus what it is that we can deliver at the quality that we say we want to deliver at, with that iron triangle of scope, resources, and time and quality can't give. And so in some cases, we've gone back and we've looked at our program budget, and we've said there's not enough time to do it right, given what we're trying to do. So we're scoping back some of the things that we're doing. And I can give you examples of that if you're really interested. But all of this, again, feeds into the plan of excellence. So with that, that's kind of that's the summary of the 7 points. And you have any questions, then you want to answer them.
Are those 7 points or that text what's in your circle?
This plan of excellence circle?
Yeah.
No, I'll give you a copy of this.
I can't read.
This is coming next week.
You can't, I can't.
Well, I have to pick these back up.
You have to pick them back up?
Well,
That's fine for
they're
now.
gonna present this to you at the next one, but you'll see that what the first couple of them are directly related. I think we map into about 5 of them. I think that these 7 points map into 5 of those, but those are now corporate initiatives. That's or agency-wide initiatives.
Under the data governance, talking about the request tracking process, I presume that part of it, not only tracking that requests are happening so you can see it at different levels or something, but also is part of that somebody requesting data telling you what they're using it for, so that you.
Yes.
I mean, that seems the most critical thing is to.
So that's exactly what. So we look at who's requesting it. We ask for who the ultimate user is, because a lot of times you're requesting it for somebody else, like for the city of Carlsbad, or for for Kim Kawada, or whatever it is. So we see who it's being requested for. We're asking what is the analysis that's being performed, and then there are several other questions that are asked so that we understand whether or not they're even requesting the right data, or make sure we give them.
Appropriate use of that data. Right.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
And one of the things that we found, just anecdotally, is CPI indexes. There's a lot of different CPI indices, and depending on what you're looking at, we would recommend that you use different CPI indices. And so when the person requests something like that, we go back to them and we try to ask them, what are you using this for? And make sure that they're getting the right one, it's measured in the right dollars, et cetera. So.
Is that outside expert review panel and sort of an ongoing living function, or was it viewed as more of a one-time fix?
So we called back a subset of, so they gave us all these recommendations, and we called back a subset of the expert review panel to then take a look at the work that we had done subsequently with the actual forecasted numbers. So what they were looking at was whether or not they made sense, now that we're using the model. So we call them back as we need them, and then there are recommendations that are made by the expert review panel that we took those to the board and said, here's what they recommend. Like, for instance, there was a recommendation that we strive for a 5% vacancy rate in the housing market, because that would be a healthy economy. That we should take a look at vacation rentals, and they should not be counted as occupiable units because people can't buy them, they're taken off the market. So our expert review panel gives us these type of information, we present it to the board, and then the board gives us feedback on it. And it's been successful so far, and right now, the way it is, they're called in when we have these milestones. That makes sense. It wasn't a one-time thing, this would be an ongoing thing. So the next time I can foresee bringing them in is we, like I said, we hired Beacon Economics. They're doing our short-term forecast. When those numbers come back, even though they're coming from a third-party reputable source, I would call an expert review panel to say, here's what our short-term economic forecast says. Does this make sense to you? Is this what you're seeing in the region? So we'll validate it at every step of the way. And that's.
I never realized that group was that big.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes, with all the things you're doing regionally, there's a lot of things I just didn't realize were under that section.
Yeah, it was.
Like crime and data, all that kind of data, like, yeah.
If it's data, it's probably in our group, and there's just a tremendous amount of it. And that's the reason I put those slides in for the board too, is because I don't think they understood what we did. They think we did forecasts, and that forecast was it was one variable out of one model that went into the work that we do at Sandec. So.
Yeah, in some contexts, so folks could have seen you or Marty before and the thing, and assume you've got a group of 6 people doing economic stuff, and that's they're just not even understand all of it. So, Grady?
One thing I was curious about, you know, you're not the only one, Sandec isn't the only one wrestling with these things amongst major transportation agencies around the country and the world. And are there, you know, occasions where, you know, you have opportunities to get together with your peers from other major transportation agents and planning agencies, regional planning agencies, to talk about these kinds of things so that there are shared best practices and this and that? You mentioned that 2 days sort of symposium you did relating to the cross-border thing, but are there more of those kinds of things where you can actually...
There are. So we have a meeting that we're hosting here in San Diego next month of all of the regional cogs that do transportation modeling, so all the way out into Arizona. And it's a time where my peers and also, well, mostly the modeling peers will get together and we do presentations and talk about this type of stuff. And so this will be talked about over there, and they do keep an eye on what we're doing. I mean, last year we didn't do a modeling forum because we were right in the middle of trying to figure out what was going on. But this year we're hosting it. We typically host it here in San Diego, so, and that's a two-day event. So we can kind of share best practices.
Cool.
I mean, the biggest thing that we did, the fundamental thing that we did is, besides implementing formalized processes and procedures, is that we no longer are doing all of the modeling ourselves, that we're now relying on experts to do things where the experts know what they're doing. So Muni Services knows how much sales tax is being collected from every single business in San Diego. Like, you know, and they know what's happening in each car dealership. They know if there's a leasing coming up and stuff, and they can forecast that much better than we will ever be able to. So we have no more pride in terms of inventing it here. I don't want to invent the forecast. I want to use the best of breed from these outside agencies who know what they're doing, and then we put it together, and then my group is going to forecast on, is going to really focus on forecasting down to the sub-regional area so that we can understand how all this information is going to impact different communities within San Diego, how the transportation network is going to work, et cetera. So our focus is to know the San Diego landscape better than anybody else, but these regional drivers are all coming from outside now.
With this new plan in place, how do you see any new revenue estimates as far as each month and year going forward? How is there a delay in this process, or how does that work when your new revenue estimates? Is this going to change the way it's done, but the way the numbers are going to? I don't know if I'm asking that right. It's a process, new process in place, right?
Yes.
So how will that affect your estimating your
the long term
accuracy,
or the short term?
Short term.
So I think that the accuracy of the short term has gone up significantly since we've started to use Muni Services. So we get reports from them on a quarterly basis. We get information on the amount of tax that the state of California has collected, and they feed all that information back. And that was the data that we used too. But we had a model internally where we did a forecast of what sales tax revenues would look like over the next 5 years. And we worked with Muni Services to write a short-term forecast model for us based upon the numbers that they have and what they know about each individual industry and business. So now they give us back those numbers and the forecast at the same time. So it's actually almost quicker for me at this point to be able to do that. And it's, okay, we haven't gone through a recessionary period yet, so I don't know how accurate it's going to be if we hit a recession. But they've been pretty spot on now for the last couple of quarters. And we do have with them too an optimistic scenario and a recessionary scenario. And so we can see what the impact would be to sales tax revenue if we went into a recession. So right now the recessionary scenario, they have a recession happening sometime in 2022. There's like a 4% decrease in overall sales tax revenue that year. And it's based upon looking at all of the historical revenue collection lows during downturns in the economy. But that type of information we can now feed to Jose to be able to put it into his model to see whether or not our plan of finance, we can now say, well, here's our pessimistic and our optimistic scenario. So he'll have a better idea of whether or not we're going to be able to make those numbers out in the future based on different scenarios. So.
And so as part of that, do you get guidance from the board as to how optimistic or conservative they want to be on making those kinds of, where do you fit within the cones for planning purposes? Or is it more that they look to you for your best estimate and they want to plan around that?
You know, they really haven't used the cones to tell us, yeah, we don't think it's in the middle of the cone. We think it should be more towards the optimistic or the less optimistic. They really haven't gone in that direction. Where they have gone is more in the direction of, we don't think that this particular revenue source is all that certain or uncertain. And so they say either take it out or keep it. So it's more in that level.
That's what they're doing right now.
That's what they're doing right now.
Rather constrained.
Yep. Yep.
Well, thanks. This is
Awesome.
great.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Do you need these back?
Yeah, and we'll bring them back to you next month, and we'll have to explain all of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rick. That was the last item. Next meeting is scheduled for July 11th at 9:30.
Can I just bring up one thing
Yes,
before we
of course.
formally adjourn? You know, just reflecting back on the annual report, it strikes me that we have a consensus and you've already gotten Dick's input. I'm wondering if, I don't know if there's utility that we only talked about 2 changes, right? Could
Well,
we
you're talking
actually?
about 2 changes, but one of them you decided to keep, the other one we're
One
taking out the
is we're
paragraph.
taking, yes, right,
Yep.
exactly. And so I'm wondering if can we actually approve the annual report now, subject to just the 2 changes, which I think are fairly, I mean, there's not a lot of subjectivity related to the 2 changes, right? One is a pull out.
Tessa, this item was for discussion?
It was, well, they can take an action on any item, even if it is just
Okay.
discussion or
Well,
information.
I guess I'm just wondering if, as opposed to wait till July, there's actual utility.
Yeah, I mean, if you feel
Getting it out
comfortable with
sooner.
the report as it stands, I mean, we can just make those 2, or actually that 1 change, take out that paragraph. We'll need to add in something in that blank space, maybe a couple pictures or something, I don't know.
Do you actually have to add something to that?
So we'll have to see how it
Yeah, maybe
That's
just
how it
rearrange
yeah.
things. It would look kind of weird to have that blank space there.
I get that, I'm just trying to.
Or the portions where
So maybe it's just a matter of keeping the remaining content, but just, you know, kind of rearrange it so that it uses
I
that space.
remember 2, maybe 3 tops.
Well, I don't know, I guess just in terms of the timing of all this, if it doesn't really make any difference in terms of the timing, then just wait till July. But it just strikes me we're really down kind of like within the last 1 or 2%. I kind of agree. And
Yeah, I
so
mean,
why just prolong it for?
Sure, I mean, if you want to take action today and just
And
give us
maybe,
direction
you know,
to
just delegate
finalize it.
the subcommittee to do a final
Clarification, you
review.
guys said Dick weighed in on the part that you.
Yeah, they said
Yeah.
that.
And he was comfortable on.
With
part
how
of
it-
both
how it
of those.
reads, yep.
Okay.
I agree. So, you want
Okay,
to make
so
that
we'll-
motion?
Yeah, so okay, so in that regard, I would move that we approve the report, and perhaps with the subcommittee just having a last look to validate that we're taking out, what was, I don't have it right in front of me, we're just gonna be removing
Yeah, remove the
the
executive
reference
director
to the
paragraph.
executive director. And then what was the other thing?
No, I think it was a question, but I think,
I think I wrote through my.
yeah.
I have one typo that I want to ask about. Is that okay? I'm just, on page 13, Senate Bill 1 provides support to meet local needs. One example illustrates the impact these funds have been in the region is the recent passage. Well, can't you just say enactment of Senate Bill 1?
So instead of passage, enactment?
It's not recent passage, can't you just say enactment? The recent, it passed in 2016,
SB 1?
or last year, it was last year,
It was in,
16.
yeah, that's right.
16.
Oh, it was April 2017.
Was it April 17th? So is it fair to say recent? Or is it, would you rather say, I mean, it sounds more.
Enactment?
It was enacted.
Yeah.
You can say recent enactment, I guess, or enactment without, would you guys prefer?
No, it's good, it's fine.
Just say enactment and get rid of recent.
Yep, we'll do that.
It's a little minor.
Yeah, I'm just looking at that. Yeah, and assuming you can fill in the yellow XX on that same page below there.
Yeah.
We're not really, there's nothing else really to talk about, right?
There's not.
Okay.
Okay, so
You can do those.
so then I move that we approve the draft.
So we'll take out the paragraph, you know, finalize like this, the yellow XX, do this recent passage enactment. Maybe we can just send it right back to the subcommittee for
Subcommittee
one
and-
final quick look and,
Yeah,
okay.
so that's my motion.
Second by Brad. All those in favor?
Another
Thank you.
clarification, and not related to that, but related to our meeting, are we back in August?
Normally, I think we are, but I think we make that decision.
It's up to you.
And then we do make it later if we don't decide, because they're scheduled every month, right?
They're scheduled every month, but if
We
you're,
anticipate that it's a likelihood, I was throwing a calendar issue, I'm just trying to.
I would say yes.
Most likely not.
So that,
you need to take action at the next meeting.
is there also a formal obligation that this gets presented to the board?
Yeah, we do need to present it.
And so then this would facilitate doing this in July as opposed to waiting basically until September. Thank you.
Motion to adjourn?
Mission accomplished.